It was winter on the Russian front, a season that turned men into ghosts and armies into shadows. In November 1942, while the world's eyes were fixed on the triumph at Stalingrad, another battle raged hundreds of miles to the north, a brutal, hidden struggle that history would almost forget. It was called Operation Mars, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's grand offensive against the German lines at Rzhev, a campaign meant to shatter the Wehrmacht's defenses west of Moscow once and for all. Instead, it became a frozen nightmare, a place where courage met futility, where divisions vanished into snow and smoke, and where Soviet soldiers fought and died in silence, while the world celebrated victory elsewhere. For months, the Battle of Rzhev devoured men and machines on a scale that defied imagination, a blood-soaked secret buried beneath the myth of triumph. The Rzhev Salient, a vast bulge in the front line held by Germany's Army Group Center, had haunted Soviet planners since 1941. It was a dagger pointed at Moscow, a fortified region of forests, rivers, and endless mud, defended by veterans hardened through a year of relentless warfare. The terrain itself seemed designed for death: narrow causeways, frozen marshes, and thick pine forests that swallowed entire divisions. Yet to Zhukov, the architect of Stalingrad's success, Rzhev represented both a strategic necessity and a test of will. He believed that a massive offensive, supported by armor, artillery, and overwhelming manpower, could finally break the German line and liberate the heartland of Western Russia. Operation Mars was his answer, launched under secrecy and fueled by the same determination that had carried him to victory before. But this time, the enemy was ready. On November 25, 1942, the Soviet attack began under skies heavy with snow. Over 1,800 tanks and hundreds of thousands of men surged forward into the blizzard. The plan called for multiple armies to encircle and annihilate the German Ninth Army, commanded by the cunning General Walter Model, a master of defensive warfare. From the first hour, everything went wrong. Soviet tanks bogged down in deep snowdrifts and minefields, communications failed, German artillery, perfectly positioned, tore the advancing waves to pieces. Machine guns rattled from hidden bunkers as entire battalions were cut down before reaching their objectives. The snow turned red, then black, then silent again. As the days passed, the battlefield became a vision of hell. The frozen ground was littered with wrecked T-34s and bodies half buried in the drifts. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, and still the attacks continued. Soviet troops fought with grim determination, advancing by inches, capturing villages only to lose them hours later. Supplies faltered, blood froze, and the front devolved into chaos. Zhukov, believing the Germans were close to collapse, ordered wave after wave forward, unaware that his intelligence had underestimated Model's defenses. The German Ninth Army fought like a cornered animal, withdrawing, regrouping, and counterattacking with brutal precision. Each Soviet breakthrough was swallowed by a counterblow, each success erased by a new disaster. For the soldiers trapped in the forests around Rzhev, there was no glory, only endurance. They fought not for victory, but for survival. The snow concealed mass graves, the trees hung heavy with frozen uniforms, and the rivers ran dark with oil and blood. Villages changed hands a dozen times, and every hill seemed to have its own name written in death. The sound of artillery never ceased. It became the heartbeat of the battlefield. The survivors would later call it the Rzhev Meat Grinder, a place where men entered and never returned. In less than a month, Operation Mars consumed nearly 400,000 Soviet soldiers. It achieved nothing. The German line held. When the offensive failed, Soviet command fell silent. The operation was buried in secrecy, overshadowed by the triumph at Stalingrad unfolding to the south. Propaganda celebrated victory while quietly erasing disaster. For decades, the truth of Rzhev remained hidden behind closed archives, its veterans forgotten, its story untold. Only later would historians uncover the scale of the tragedy, that Zhukov's so-called twin operation to Stalingrad had been one of the costliest and most futile offensives of the entire war. It was a wound that the Soviet Union never spoke of, a reminder that even heroes could bleed, and that even the greatest victories cast long shadows. The Battle of Rzhev stands today as a monument to endurance and the limits of human will. It reminds us that not all wars are won by glory, and not all victories are clean. Beneath the myth of the Eastern Front lies a frozen truth, that courage can coexist with tragedy, and that even the mightiest armies can break against the unyielding face of winter and war. Tonight we return to those forgotten fields of snow and silence, to the men who fought, froze, and vanished beneath history's frost. This is the story of Operation Mars, Zhukov's forgotten disaster at Rzhev, where ambition met the abyss, and the price of war was written in ice and blood. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Snowdrifts whispered across the plains near Rzhev, curling around broken fences and frozen helmets buried in the earth. The front had gone quiet, not peaceful but heavy, like the breath before a scream. A lone Red Army sentry, Private Mikhail Borodin, stood at the edge of the forest, his rifle barrel silvered with frost. To the west, a German flare arced lazily into the pale sky, illuminating nothing but distance. Between them stretched 50 kilometers of no man's land, an emptiness sculpted by shellfire and time. Wolves moved through the tree lines at night, scavenging among forgotten outposts. Both armies had paused, their movements buried beneath the snow as if the war itself were holding its breath. Field telephones crackled faintly in the cold, their lines frozen like veins through a dying body. Officers murmured about new offensives, about orders from Moscow and Berlin that demanded miracles. Yet for now there was only the creak of wood, the hiss of wind, and the sound of a front waiting to awaken. What they didn't yet know was that this silence was not rest. It was preparation. Behind Soviet lines, miles away from the frozen front, trains screeched into sidings heavy with tanks, ammunition, and men wrapped in rough wool. The Rzhev Salient had become a logistical web, tens of thousands of soldiers gathering beneath banners they barely understood. Commissars read orders aloud beneath dim bulbs, invoking Stalin's call for simultaneous blows across the entire Eastern Front. Each man believed he was part of the decisive stroke that would break the German line once and for all. Beyond them, German reconnaissance aircraft, their engines whining against the cold air, photographed every Soviet buildup, each shadow revealing what the snow tried to conceal. In Berlin, the maps were studied with satisfaction. Model's Ninth Army, they said, had turned Rzhev into an iron fortress. But even in the warmth of command bunkers, the generals felt unease, as though something vast and unseen was gathering just beyond sight. The Eastern Front was too large to control, too cold to predict. Somewhere beneath that quiet surface, history was stirring. The Rzhev Salient jutted toward Moscow like a dagger still lodged in the wound of 1941. It was here that the Wehrmacht had been stopped the previous winter, at unimaginable cost, and here they remained, entrenched, determined, almost defiant. The Germans called it der Brückenkopf, the bridgehead. To them it was a bastion from which they could strike again toward Moscow when the weather turned. For the Soviets, it was an insult to their survival, a reminder that the enemy still stood less than 200 kilometers from the capital. Frozen rivers marked the lines of advance, the Vazuza, the Osuga, the Volga, names whispered by soldiers who had learned to fear geography as much as bullets. In these forests, artillery could disappear in seconds, muffled by the snow. Tanks broke through the ice and never rose again. To command this land was to command a graveyard. Yet Stalin wanted more than control. He wanted erasure, and that desire would drive everything that followed. On November 17th, 1942, General Georgy Zhukov arrived at the Kalinin front headquarters, his heavy coat dusted with frost, his eyes red from sleepless nights. Reports from the south spoke of success, of encirclement at Stalingrad, of German divisions collapsing along the Volga. Stalin demanded the same in the north. "We will crush them here," Zhukov said, his voice quiet but absolute. The plan was bold, almost reckless, simultaneous strikes by 4 armies converging to encircle the German 9th. Operation Mars, they called it. Soviet engineers prepared pontoon bridges in darkness. Artillery was calibrated in silence. Even as the frost deepened, the timetable did not shift. Zhukov believed that the enemy was weary, that the element of surprise would shatter the German defense before the year's end. What no one imagined, not yet, was that the salient would consume his ambition as it had consumed every army before him. Among the Red Army ranks, the soldiers spoke less of glory and more of warmth. They boiled snow for tea, scraped frost from their rifles, and waited for orders that seemed to come from another world. Private Ivan Kozlov, age 22, wrote in his diary that the cold is like an enemy that never sleeps. He was right. Carbines jammed, engines froze, and the mere act of breathing felt like swallowing glass. Yet each morning the political officers gathered them in formation, reciting the promise that the war would soon be over. Across the line, German sentries in long grey coats stamped their boots, sharing cigarettes under blackened trees. They too had heard rumours of a Soviet push, of Zhukov's winter, of another slaughter in the making. Both sides stared across the snow, unable to see the faces that mirrored their own. In this world, even hatred seemed tired. The front was not divided by ideology anymore. It was divided by endurance. Along the rail lines, convoys of T-34 tanks rumbled toward the front, their engines coughing black smoke into the white sky. Each machine was a miracle of steel and desperation, simple enough to repair in a snowstorm, powerful enough to crush ice and wire alike. The crews huddled inside, their breath freezing on the metal walls, whispering about where they would be sent. On the German side, 88mm guns were dug into ridges, their barrels coated in camouflage paint, their crews veterans of the previous year's advance. Model's doctrine was simple: the front must hold, not by retreat, but by elasticity. Let the Soviets strike and bleed. To him the salient was not a weakness, but a trap waiting to be sprung. Snow fell steadily over the gun pits, muffling the sound of hammers and saws. It was the kind of quiet that only comes before great noise. What both generals shared, unknowingly, was the same illusion that winter could be tamed by discipline alone. Far from the trenches, life in the rear unfolded with eerie rhythm. Women in Valdai villages wove white camouflage nets from torn sheets. Children dragged sledges piled with shells to waiting trucks. Priests prayed over empty coffins, already inscribed with names not yet dead. In a frozen hangar, mechanics struggled to keep the P-2 bombers running, their oil thickening in the cold, the engines groaning as if reluctant to wake. Over the radio, Moscow broadcast stirring marches, the brass notes echoing into a countryside too tired to sing. In Berlin, The newsreels showed calm German officers by a map, assuring the public that the front near Rzhev was stable. Stability, though, was an illusion, stretched thin over a front that could crack with a single wrong order. What they didn't yet know was that both sides were planning the same thing, an end to this waiting, and when it came, the silence would break like glass. By late November, the snow deepened, and the daylight shortened to a few grey hours. Soviet forward observers watched through binoculars as German convoys crawled along the frozen roads toward Olenino. To them, it looked like weakness, reinforcement, not readiness. Zhukov saw opportunity. Model saw inevitability. The front was a chessboard neither man truly controlled. In one of the dugouts, a young soldier warmed his hands over a candle and whispered, "It feels like the world has stopped moving." He wasn't wrong. Every heartbeat along that front was synchronized with something vast and invisible, a machinery of fate turning toward its next act. The frost thickened on every barrel, every boot, every hope, and in the quiet between two winters, the land waited, white, patient, and listening for thunder. Under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, the map of the Eastern Front looked less like strategy and more like a wound. Red and blue lines snaked across its frozen surface, converging at a single bulge that protruded west of Moscow, the Rzhev Salient. General Zhukov leaned over it, his gloved finger tracing the curve where the German Ninth Army held its ground. The paper was stiff from cold, its creases crusted with ash and spilled tea. Outside the tent, a blizzard hissed against the canvas, drowning the low murmur of staff officers arguing over rail timetables. Every inch of that map represented 1,000 lives, and the salient itself a dagger pointed toward the Soviet heart. Zhukov exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud over the ink. "We cannot leave it there," he said quietly. "So long as it stands, Moscow is never safe." The room fell silent. No one needed to be told what that meant. The Rzhev Salient was more than territory. It was geometry made deadly. Extending roughly 60 miles toward Moscow, and 50 miles deep, it allowed German artillery to reach railways that fed the capital. It was a protrusion the Soviets could neither ignore nor easily remove. From the air it looked like a clenched fist, one that had resisted every attempt to pry it open since 1941. Deep within it, General Walter Model's Ninth Army dug in like frost-bitten roots, spreading bunkers, trenches, and anti-tank belts across a landscape of forest and marsh. German engineers called it Der Igel, the hedgehog bristling with barbed wire and guns. For every Soviet offensive, Model had a counterstroke, a withdrawal that lured and punished. The salient's very shape favored defense. Its roads were narrow, its rivers treacherous, its snow concealing miles of minefields. What they didn't yet know was that this single piece of ground would swallow more soldiers than many entire campaigns. Rzhev was no longer a position, it was a sentence. At dawn, reconnaissance pilots rose through sheets of fog, their Yak-1s Saar and Messerschmitts circling over the same stretch of tortured earth. From the cockpit, the world below seemed almost abstract, white plains, black rivers, and the faint grey scars of trench lines. Soviet airmen radioed coordinates of German gun emplacements, their voices calm, clipped, almost resigned. In return, German spotters in twin-engine Fa 189 Uhu aircraft photographed Soviet assembly zones with methodical precision. Every flash in the snow, every wisp of exhaust was recorded and relayed to artillery grids below. A strange symmetry had formed in the sky. Two enemies watching the same field, both convinced of their own inevitability. On the ground, the images arrived at command tents hours later, projected onto walls for generals to argue over. From above, Rzhev looked calm. From below, it was a labyrinth of death, waiting to be triggered. No one imagined that the maps they studied so calmly would one day describe a graveyard. General Model's logic was simple and brutal. "A line that bends does not break," he told his officers, his voice flat as the winter wind. His defenses were layered like the rings of a tree: minefields, then trenches, then camouflaged strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire. Each battalion knew exactly where to fall back, where to regroup, where to bleed the enemy dry. The men respected him for it, even as they cursed the endless digging, the cold that turned shovels into torture. Model walked among them in a tattered overcoat, his boots black with ice, his face unreadable. He understood that holding Rzhev was holding the entire central front, a hinge between Moscow and Smolensk. Around him, field kitchens steamed, medical wagons froze in their tracks, and the smell of diesel hung like breath over the land. Above all, he demanded silence and preparation. "The Russians will come," he said, "and we will let them die here." No prophecy was ever spoken more calmly. To the east, General Ivan Konev studied his own maps, the ink already smudged from gloved hands. He had fought here the year before, and remembered how the snow could devour entire regiments. Konev was known for his aggression, for driving men forward even when the cost defied arithmetic. Yet Rzhev tested even his resolve. Each approach route was narrow, each crossing exposed. "The land itself fights us," he muttered, echoing what so many commanders before him had thought. Behind him, supply officers catalogued fuel shortages, food ration cuts, and rail delays. The numbers told a story of exhaustion, but the orders from Moscow told a story of faith. Konev knew he would have to attack again soon, whether his troops were ready or not. What he didn't know was that this would not be the last time his men froze and bled beneath the same sky. Rzhev sat between two magnets of destruction, Moscow to the east, Smolensk to the west, each pulling men, machines, and destiny toward itself. The Germans saw it as a shield against another Soviet surge. The Soviets saw it as a scar that must be cut away. In the villages along the Volga, civilians lived like shadows, their houses shattered, their fields long since buried. They dug shelters beneath what remained of their barns, and prayed that no army noticed them. Occasionally soldiers would pass through, leaving behind the smell of smoke and fear. A German patrol might stop for an hour, a Soviet for a day. Ownership meant little here. Every footprint vanished beneath snow, every banner replaced by another. To live in the Rzhev Salient was to live in the pause between occupations. What they didn't yet know was that for most of them, there would be no occupation left to survive. By late afternoon, the Volga River lay frozen, a pale mirror stretching toward the horizon. Sunlight glinted off the ice, so bright it blinded the sentries who watched its far bank. Under the surface, the current still moved, silent, relentless, unstoppable. Engineers on both sides tested its thickness with cautious steps, marking safe crossings with branches and colored flags. The river had become both barrier and bridge, a boundary that belonged to no one. Soviet artillery was moved closer each night, its barrels camouflaged with snow and straw. German spotters could see the smoke plumes but not the guns themselves, and the uncertainty gnawed at them. The sound of soaring ice echoed faintly through the still air. The Volga had seen empires come and go. Now it waited for another to test its patience. Soon it would bear the weight of armies once again. Night fell quickly over the salient, the horizon dissolving into a blur of smoke and frost. In the German bunkers buried deep beneath snowdrifts, candles flickered against walls lined with ammunition boxes. In Soviet headquarters, men leaned over maps, their breath visible as they argued about artillery timings. Between them lay the silent geography of fate, rivers, forests, and fields that would soon ignite. For months, both sides had stared at this bulge on the map, convinced it was the key to victory. They were both right and both wrong. The salient would not decide the war, but it would decide the cost of it. To hold Rzhev was to hold a knife's point at Moscow, and every man bled to keep it sharp. They were already moving when the lamps went out. Men shuffled in boots that squeaked like distant birds through the snow, and a sergeant in a canvas tent stamped the frost from his hands as he passed a sheaf of papers to a young staff officer. In the half-light, a map unfolded across a wooden table, rivers drawn in ink like seams, red pencils marking axes of advance that cut toward the heart of the salient. General Georgy Zhukov stood over that map as if listening to it breathe, his collar up against the cold, and his eyes hollowed by months of war. He wanted momentum, not attrition. Around him, aides bent to mark times, organize trains, and calculate the number of pontoon sections that would be needed for the crossings. The engineers' lists full of steel girders, ropes, and the wooden trestles that would become temporary bridges under shell fire. Outside the tent, the distant thrum of a T-34's diesel could be heard, a mechanical heartbeat that promised motion. Crews warmed engines with buckets of boiling water, checking magneto sparks until the motors coughed to life. Briefings ran in whispered currents through the command posts, an order balanced between optimism and a calendar that had no sympathy for weather. Officers read out schedules, artillery lifts at hour X, infantry in waves, armored exploitation on axis Y, everything timed to the second as if time could be trusted. Men were drilled to cross at night, to move silent on improvised footbridges, to lay down suppressing fire calculated to the range of German 7.92 mm belts and the angles of entrenched embrasures. The plan took shape like an organism, ambitious, modular, and hungry for space. What they didn't yet know was how much the ground itself would revolt against those plans. The snow would not be a blank page, but a trap that swallowed men, ammo, and morale in equal measure. In the depots, locomotives hissed as they coughed steam into the white air, spitting out wagons heavy with artillery shells, crates stamped with cereals, and columns of winter clothing meant to ward off frostbite. Quartermasters argued over tonnage. A single 122 mm shell could quiet an enemy embrasure, but a shortage of tractors meant that many would never reach the guns on time. In a makeshift barracks, a logistics officer named Captain Petrov cross-referenced station timetables with a list of engineers and their pontoon sections, noting the rail gauges and bridge load limits that would decide which units moved first. Signals teams practiced laying telephone wire across frozen ditches, their insulated cables snapping in the cold like brittle ropes. They knew that a severed line could mean the difference between a coordinated advance and battalions walking blind into mortar fire. Across the front, Soviet tank crews rehearsed night crossings with headlights low, feeling the resistance of ice under the tracks and learning how the T-34's wide tracks chewed through snow and soft earth to find traction. In those rehearsals, drivers spoke in low tones about engine idling and radiator clogs, about how the V2 diesel would cough when the temperature dropped, and how spare radiators would be prized like talismans. Officers tried to fold contingency into doctrine, alternate routes, secondary crests, and fallback timings, as if redundancy could outmatch misfortune. Yet in every calculation there was an undercurrent of hope. Stalin's signal from Moscow had demanded simultaneous blows, and to refuse was to court political oblivion. No one imagined this would become a ledger of losses rather than a ledger of triumph. The arithmetic of courage did not account for mud that swallowed wheels or river ice that betrayed crossing parties. In the corridors where maps hung, Zhukov and his chiefs argued over concentration, how to mass artillery, so that German trenches would be shattered, but supply columns would not be pinned to choke points. They debated calibers and arcs, the geometry of fire that could suppress MG-34 nests, while masking the infantry's final approach. Artillery officers measured ranges by eye and by trigonometrical tables, translating the breastwork of the salient into numbers that could be converted into explosive arcs. Their logs recorded not only distances, but predicted crater depths and the time of flight that would stagger enemy response. Engineers compiled lists of pontoons, how many planks per span, how many men to ferry across per trip, and they rehearsed the rhythm of assault crossings until it became a machine-like chant. Political officers walked among the units, bolstering morale with speeches that spoke of the motherland and of Moscow's safety, while the men checked their rifles and cursed the cold that turned lube into glue. Commanders on the ground learned to translate paper into terrain. A red arrow on a map meant a forested ravine in reality, a marsh under a thin skin of ice, and the difference was the sound of men disappearing. Every schematic produced a sequence, shipment, assembly, rehearsal, and finally motion, that relied on fragile links to hold. Secrecy was paramount, radio silence was ordered, and couriers carried the details like contraband through checkpoints. What they didn't yet know was how fragile those links would prove. A snapped cable, a delayed convoy, a misread coordinate could ripple into catastrophe. At night, in the tented staffs, briefings folded into whispers, as junior officers traced their unit's role with trembling fingers, where to form up, which hedgerow to use for concealment, the precise declination to adjust on an artillery piece to strike a white clearing 2 kilometers beyond the second creek. A colonel named Sokolov checked his watches against the timetable. Synchronization meant everything, and any drift would produce gaps wide enough for German counters to exploit. Reconnaissance reports arrived in bursts, aerial photos showing smoke columns, partisan dispatches, noting movements of enemy wagons, and intercepted messages that suggested the Germans were shifting reserves. Technicians tested wireless sets and adjusted antenna, mindful that the F-modes would cut through static at certain frequencies. A functioning radio could direct an attack or summon life-saving smoke. In the workshops, men wrestled with fuel lines and carburetors, watching the temperature gauges, and learning that an overheated engine in a half-frozen landscape was as useless as a broken rifle. And always there was the quiet presence of Stalin's expectations, the Kremlin's insistence that coordinated offensives must be launched west and south, that supply and sacrifice were to be the same coin. The staff worked like clockmakers, polishing each cog until it gleamed. No one imagined the clock would be set to run on ice and rust. The machinery of war has a habit of failing in the coldest places. Orders moved outward from command. Like ripples on a pond, division commanders issued marching routes to regimental leaders, who in turn told company commanders where to assemble their men. Platoons rehearsed assault drills under the flares of each other's lanterns. In a field company, Sergeant Nikolai Pavlov drilled his men in silent movement, how to cross a footbridge without a wooden plank announcing their passing, how to lower a rifle without the sling clacking like a broken bone. Engineers waited at riverbanks through nights of sleet, measuring ice thickness, marking weak points with stakes and die, and constructing false approaches to mislead enemy observers. Supply columns were staged behind tree lines, their loads labeled and chained, food, ammunition, fuel, and medical stretchers packed in that order to prioritize life. Meanwhile, political departments organized briefings to be repeated to every unit, translating strategic aims into personal duty. The slogans softened the terror of the unknown, with phrases about liberation and revenge. Each rehearsal produced a cause and effect chain. A pontoon placed poorly would force men to linger. Lingering men would attract artillery, artillery would channel momentum into death. The staff logged every delay and adjusted timetables, but daylight leaked through the tent seams and reminded them that plans were not weatherproof. What they didn't yet know was that the enemy read weather like scripture and would use ice and fog as allies against coordination. As the date drew near, movements became more furtive. Trains were rerouted to avoid German reconnaissance, and night marches increased the strain on horses and men, the draft animals' breath steaming in clouds as harnesses creaked under frost. Mechanics improvised hand warmers and packed engine blocks with insulation, knowing that a seized crankshaft could strand a whole battery. At command level, Zhukov insisted on simultaneous pressure across multiple axes, reasoning that dispersion would fix German reserves and prevent a focused counterpunch. His logic was military and elegant, but it required exactitude from men and machines that winter stole. Briefing by briefing, officers traced the cascading effects. A failed crossing would mean stalling armor. Stalled armor would give the Luftwaffe a window to spot and strike, and any delay would let Model reposition his hedgehog of defenses. Behind the optimism, however, there was a brittle confidence, a belief that human will and doctrinal rigor could bend the weather itself. Men rehearsed river crossings under the light of flares, lowering pontoons like a husband and wife, learning to dance in a room that might collapse. They practiced unloading T-30 Forces at slope angles that tested clutch engagements and watched how the track spat snow. Every movement taught them something about traction and timing. No one imagined this would become a contest, not merely between armies, but between man and the merciless physics of winter. When the first orders for movement finally crackled through, they did so like thunder that arrived a second before lightning. Columns slipped from sidings, engineers pulled pontoon sections from flat cars, and the air filled with the metallic stench of oil and wet wool. Units moved in a choreography that had been rehearsed in frozen barns, each man knowing his mark, yet every mark was subject to the caprice of terrain. The initial advances would be cautious, calculated to conserve men even as the timetable demanded speed. Assaulting units crept forward under the shadow of preparatory barrages, counting paces between tree trunks and hedgerows. Zhukov watched those first movements with a mixture of hope and the distant calm of a man who trusted plans more than luck. He signed papers that would send men into named fields and unnamed graves, believing that concentration and secrecy would yield a decisive result. Engineers whispered about load limits and the safe span of a hastily constructed bridge, while medics readied field stations for the inevitable attrition. In the last low light before the offensive became visible across the snow, staff officers folded maps back into their oilcloth and checked watches one final time. Maps glowed red with arrows, a dream of victory drawn in ink, soon to be redrawn in blood. They began before dawn, with a single roar that seemed to come from the ground itself. A rolling crescendo as batteries of 122 mm and 152 mm howitzers opened along the Soviet front. Snow exploded in columns as shells punched through drifts, sending plumes of white into the low sky and turning the plain into a ragged, steaming map. Sergeant Pavel Morozov counted the seconds between flash and thunder, using the time of flight to estimate distance, then shouted the correction forward: lift the barrage 200 meters, delay the creeping fire by 12 seconds. Artillery observers crouched behind frozen berms, their binoculars rimmed with ice, and radioed coordinates back to batteries whose barrels smoked like exhausted lungs. The crews worked the breech blocks with red, numbed hands. Katyusha batteries, 8 rails loaded with rockets, fired in fan-shaped volleys, their launchers recoiling and sending a bouquet of metal screaming over tree lines. The rockets left trails of orange that laced the grey morning like burning veins, From the German trenches, men stared at the sky and tried to read the pattern of impact, noting azimuths and adjusting eye-watered calculations to bring reserve guns to bear. In those first hours, the world narrowed to ranges 1,800 meters to the nearest farmstead, 600 meters to the hedgerow, where an MG-34 might be hidden, 50 meters between one man and his dying comrade. Everything moved in a cause and effect arithmetic. Barrage, advance, bite, hold, practiced in training, but alloyed now with real fear. The offensive had physical momentum. The snow recorded every tread, every recoil, every cry. What they didn't yet know was how quickly momentum would meet resistance, shaped by prepared geometry and cold logic. The Salient's defenders were not idle. Soviet T-34 screamed from the tree line, their V2 diesels rumbling at idling speed, tracks chewing through crust and leaving rectangles of churned black in the white. Tank commanders counted engine revolutions to judge throttle response in the freezing air, mindful that overheating radiators could seize the entire drivetrain if they forced speed. As platoons of infantry surged, engineers pushed pontoon sections over narrow river channels. Each span required precise placement and anchoring, and a misset joint could collapse under the combined weight of a T-34 and 3 crewmen. Forward Soviet regiments threw forward assault groups intended to seal breaches and cut German trenches into pockets. Every man in those groups carried grenades and short Mosin-Nagant carbines, each weapon tested for frozen firing pins and brittle springs. German defenders responded with methodical counterfire, emplacing interlocking machine gun crossfires that turned hedgerows into funnels. Veteran NCOs guided Luger and Set G-44 teams to pre-registered kill zones carved out months before. In the smoky intervals between barrages, medics moved with an efficiency learned from previous winters, pulling men into shallow shelters, stopping arterial bleeding with strips of canvas and the crude steadiness of practiced hands. The initial hours were a test of logistics and nerve. Each platoon that made it through the belts created temporary lodgements that commanders tried to expand before frost and counterattack could close them. For many on the front, the first assault felt less like charge than like being pressed through a cheesecloth of wire and steel. No one imagined this would become a lesson in attrition disguised as maneuver, where the maps promised encirclement. The landscape offered only choke and drag. Communication strained under the weight of motion. Field telephones snapped when sappers cut cable to clear obstacles, and wireless sets, operating on limited battery and shortwave vacuum tubes, sputtered with interference. Junior officers improvised message runs on skis and sledges, their breath steaming in the cold while pocket watches slipped on numb wrists. A lieutenant named Vasily Petrov recorded in his notebook the times his orders failed to arrive and how delay turned coordinated pincer movements into isolated thrusts. Tanks foundered in half-thawed marshes where permafrost hid peat bogs. A T-34's wide track could only do so much when ice fractured under 26 tons of steel. Where armor could not go, infantry probed with bayonet and sapper charges, blowing gaps in wire with satchel charges that spat flames into the white. German artillery replied with pinpoint barrages, using aerial photographs and forward observers to bracket Soviet lodgements and hammer them with 88 mm and 105 mm guns that spit twisted metal into snowbanks. Every gain required more men, more shells, more fuel, and every resource consumed made the next move harder. The offensive's early momentum began to show the first cracks of logistical overstretch. What they didn't yet know was how the weather itself would become a co-conspirator with the defenders. Sleet and fog turned battlefields into mazes where sound betrayed movement. Visibility fell to a few dozen meters at times, and commanders issued orders to close intervals lest units lose touch and drift into friendly fire. Sappers working to clear mines, learned the particular cruelty of ice-covered pressure plates. A snow-encased telemine could be invisible until the last step, when a metal foot sank, and a body launched into silence. Soviet tank crews switched to low-rev maneuvers to conserve oil and prevent clutch slipping, listening to the gearbox notes that meant life or death. In one grove, a KV-1's heavy hull punched through an embankment and exposed it to concentrated anti-tank rifle and artillery fire. The crew fought to bring the bow machine gun to bear, even as metal screamed and welds popped. German flank units set up ambushes in hollow roads, coordinating small arms and mortar fire with a grim choreography learned from the previous year. For every pocket captured, counterattacks followed, and every counterattack forced attackers to entrench and hold territory that could not be easily supplied. The battle began to shift from bold thrusts to stubborn, costly possession. No one imagined such possession would be measured in small, frozen squares of land, and in the names scratched into ration lists. The human detail became decisive. Men who had rehearsed discipline in tents now fought exhausted, their eyes rimmed with frostbite, their tongues raw from cold. Field kitchens struggled to keep soups hot. Fuel shortages meant soldiers sometimes poured warm water into their boots to thaw their souls before marches. A sergeant named Makarov wrote of an engineer who patched a pontoon with a scrap of canvas and a prayer, an act of craft that kept a column moving for a few precious hours. Casualty evacuation became a nightmare of mud and night. Stretchers sank into thawed ruts, and the wounded shivered under oilcloth, while anesthetic was in short supply. In the lull between violent exchanges, the front registered small economies of survival: a shared piece of black bread, the careful rationing of cigarettes, the barter of boots among those whose souls had worn thin. Commanders noted that morale ebbed as sleep was denied, and hunger crept in, and they sent for reinforcements that themselves became stretched once committed. The offensive scale receded into this granular ledger of human needs. Strategy met anatomy in frozen fields. What they didn't yet know was how tightly the German defenders would clutch their lines once their reserves arrived. Model's doctrine of elastic defense began to show its teeth. Counterattacks were launched with the cold calculation of men who had practiced delay as a weapon. Small armored detachments struck exposed flanks, while coordinated mortar fire pinned the attackers in narrow kill zones. In one village, a hastily organized German Kampfgruppe rolled in with half-tracks and veteran infantry, sealing a breach that had cost several platoons their cohesion. Artillery observers adjusted fire to crater supply routes, making the resupply of forward units an act of daring rather than routine. Soviet battalions found themselves fighting not only the enemy, but time, ammunition consumption soared, and command orders to conserve often arrived after the ammunition had been spent. Radio operators relayed frantic requests for smoke screens and rocket barrages to obscure withdrawals, and engineers worked feverishly to lay improvised bridges to extract isolated companies. The front became a patchwork of lodgements and tombs, each square foot purchased with men and metal. Momentum, once a roaring wave, turned into a scramble to hold newly taken ground from the advancing teeth of the enemy. No one imagined this would become a stalemate of attrition, where initiative decayed into survival. The cost was paid in human detail and in the grinding of machinery. As evening crept over the field, searchlights cut through swirl and smoke, and platoons hunkered in hastily fortified positions, praying for rest that would not come. The injured groaned beneath blankets, while medics counted breaths and prioritized by pulse, trying to keep frostbite from turning into gangrene. Tank crews spent hours clearing ice from periscopes and prying frozen hatches with bayonets. The V2 engines sat sputtering, their pistons scoring from cold and the toll of continuous operation. Supply columns that made it forward were met with the immediate need to redistribute fuel and shells where they were most urgently required. Commanders sketched new plans under lantern light, crossing out names and replacing units as losses mounted. The offensive's early days had become a ledger of consumed human and material capital. Every success created a new set of needs that the supply system scrambled to meet. In the deep dark, the front exhaled, and the ground settled into a rhythm of watchfulness. By the third day, the snow was mottled with the dark stains of war, and the landscape bore witness to what had become of momentum. Where columns had pushed, they now held fragile salients under constant harassing fire. Where they had failed, the earth closed over the tracks and left a map of retreat. Commanders on both sides wrote terse reports. Lines crossed, objectives partially met, casualties enumerated with an economy that could not contain sorrow. For those at the front, the meaning of the operation shifted from grand encirclement to a more immediate calculus: survive until the next supply run, hold until reinforcements arrive, and bury the dead with care if and when the snow allowed. Radios crackled with orders to consolidate, to ration, to prepare for the German bite that would not be long in coming. The offensive had achieved momentum, and in doing so had given rhythm to a slaughter that would not be easily counted. The earth itself seemed to awaken, only to swallow the men who woke it. They pushed through a wall of smoke and cold, as if moving through a living thing, men stumbling, rifles slick with melting snow, and a T-34's tracks grinding in a rhythm like a slow, monstrous drum. A dozen infantrymen clung to the tank's flanks, while the driver probed soft ground with a blade of his foot, listening to the V2 diesel's cadence to feel for loss of traction. The engine's roughly 500 horsepower thrum was the only law they trusted in that strip of white. Shellfire stitched the horizon into ragged seams, and rounds from 122 howitzers punched out geysers of loam and ice at predictable ranges, each crater altering the map of approach routes. Lieutenant Mikhail Orlov shouted coordinates to a forward observer, then watched his voice disappear into the wind as men ahead sank to their knees in a thawing bog where frozen peat had turned treacherous. Tracks that rolled easily on roadbed foundered in the half-thawed morass and left hunks of iron stranded like drowned animals. Medics crawled on their stomachs beneath a curtain of smoke, administering morphine and binding shattered limbs with strips of canvas, while artillery whistles cut above them. In the village of Gori, a horse team that had hauled ammunition just hours before lay frozen in a harness, nostrils iced and breath halted, beasts that had been part of the supply chain reduced to stillness. The front line became a ledger of small failures: one bridge too weak, one jeep stuck for 3 hours, one radio antenna snapped, and a brigade left blind. Men learned the cruel mathematics of casualties versus terrain. Every lost vehicle meant heavier loads for those who remained, and every heavier load slowed the next advance. In those first frantic days, cohesion frayed not from lack of will, but from the cumulative weight of weather and physics. They moved forward because orders moved them, and the earth accepted them without complaint. What they didn't yet know was that this land would not simply resist tactics, but would reconfigure them, turning audacity into attrition, and plans into lists of names. Assault waves met German defensive belts that had been honed over the previous winter. MG-34 nests splayed intersecting fields of fire, pre-registered by Krupp-calculated fall of shot that made the snow between hedgerows a killing ground. A Soviet battalion that tried to bypass a wood found its flanks enfiladed by 88 batteries sighted on a ridge, their projectiles singing through the frost and punching torsos from foxholes. The 88's muzzle flash lit faces in a terrible brief clarity. In the confusion, units lost contact with their neighbors, and small pockets of men became isolated islands with radios that either did not reach or were already dead. Engineers attempted to blast through anti-tank obstacles with satchel charges, but frozen earth reduced the blast radius. The effect was often to unmask attackers without creating the clear path doctrine had promised. Supply columns snarled as tractors bogged down and horses slid on iced ruts, and the delay cascaded. No shells to a forward gun meant no suppression. No suppression meant no safe crossing. No crossing meant stalled momentum. Commanders like Captain Rybin watched timetables fracture into improvisation and began issuing ad hoc orders that only increased the fog of battle. The effort to secure a single farmstead consumed hours, rations, and reputations, while on the map the red arrow barely advanced. Each micro-defeat fed the larger calculus of failure. They learned to read the battlefield like a living, malicious map. Smoke meant an ambush. The smell of burned diesel meant a killed engine, and the angular collapse of a birch grove meant a crater field beneath. Sergeant Pavelieri, who had been an agricultural laborer before conscription, measured distances by tree count and not by meters, because his compass had long been lost in a snowdrift. He could tell you the last 3 places where men had frozen, and the last 3 where they had bled. Tank commanders argued about whether to push on low throttle to avoid seizure or to risk high revs for the short dash across soft ground, and the choice often decided who reached the hedgerow that day. Snipers worked like surgeons in the gaps of terrain, turning any visible silhouette into a target, sometimes with a single precise 7.62 mm round from a Mosin's long barrel. Medics, moving with a quiet deterministic urgency, counted breaths and prioritized by pulse and temperature, because hypothermia became as deadly as shrapnel in those hours. As the first week deepened, the weather cycled into sleet and then back to heavy snow, each change wiping out tracks and erasing the day's hard-gotten gains. Rations dwindled faster than commanders anticipated, because the off-road mileage chewed through horses and trucks. Every consumed loaf made the next night's march costlier. In field hospitals, surgeons performed amputations by the light of lanterns that sputtered in gusts, their hands working with a calmness that was not comfort but function. The battlefield shrank to a series of immediate choices, each with lethal consequences. What they didn't yet know was how the attrition would hollow out not only units but the narrative of success. For every ground taken 2 men were missing, and morale whispered about futility. Waves of reinforcements arrived, fresh faces with wide eyes and uncalloused fingers, and were folded into exhausted lines, only to add numbers without restoring cohesion. Officers like Major Semyonov tried to stitch new men into old tactics, but training in a quiet rear could not prepare recruits for the smell of burning flesh and diesel, for the way the snow congealed with blood and oil into a dark, indifferent crust. Artillery barrages that had been scheduled to support an advance sometimes fell short because forward observers could not see through the smoke, and when shells landed among their own, panic replaced discipline in minutes. German counterattacks exploited these gaps, using small mobile groups with armored cars and assault guns to roll up flanks where cohesion had been lost. A Soviet platoon that had secured a hedgerow found itself surrounded by enemy patrols who had crept through blind spots. Its radio was out, its ammunition low, and its hope reduced to hand grenades. The day's geometry collapsed into a night of defense, and men who had been trained to attack discovered the draining defensive skill of holding ground they had just won. Supply officers recorded losses that would carry for weeks. Machine guns burned out, scopes smashed, winter clothing shredded, all items that once gone could not be replaced in the local timetable. The meat grinder did not always make noise when it took men. Sometimes it took them quietly in small bureaucratic increments. They began to count the hidden costs that do not appear on maps, the exhaustion that dulled reflexes, the frostbite that ruined hands, the small betrayals of morale when comrades disappeared. Private Nikolai Vaznetsov, who had been a blacksmith before the war, lost the use of 2 fingers to frostbite and could no longer cock his rifle with speed. His value to the squad shifted from firepower to bundling sandbags and hauling shells. Commanders tracked such degradations because they knew coldly that a soldier with damaged hands is a dead man when a sudden charge comes at dawn. Ammunition expenditure rose exponentially as concentrated barrages failed to break hardened positions, and the requisition system could not keep pace. Trucks that arrived with shells often had to wait for engineers to clear bridges and passable roads. As attrition mounted, men began to ration courage itself, a deliberate conservation of will designed to ensure one could face the next order, the next march. Horses too became a fragile currency. Every animal lost meant fewer loads moved, and more men assigned to haul what remained. The mechanics in field workshops worked with a quiet fury to mend cracked axles and bent gearboxes, using welding torches that spat orange against the snow and the smell of burning grease, that which made the engineers feel sane. In the fog of that attrition, the operation's original promise of encirclement began to look less like strategy and more like a ledger of improvisation. What they didn't yet know was that the ground would demand not simply lives, but an entire shift in expectation. Bold maneuvers gave way to grinding possession of inches and of names. Flares at night painted trenches in a harsh white, revealing frozen faces and the rows of helmets set like tombstones. Small platoons clung to supply dumps where the last tins of meat were distributed, and every ration was an argument about fairness. Cooks who had kept their kitchens moving now boiled snow for gruel, and even that warmth was intermittent because fuel was diverted to warm engines rather than kettles. The psychological strain showed in small ways. Men refused to talk about home, or when they did their voices became hushed, as if the winter could overhear and steal their memories. Corpses that could not be burned were stacked and covered with sacking, and later, when the thaw allowed, were marked with improvised mementos: a pocket watch, a photograph, a scrap of a letter. In the command tents, generals compiled casualty lists and crossed names with a practical hand, the ink settling like frost. They knew that public declarations of success would not reconcile those lines, but the reports had to be filed anyway. Tactical initiative withered in the face of supply frictions. The more ground a unit took, the longer its supply line stretched, and the more vulnerable it became to German interdiction. The front's tempo slowed to a painful metronome of holds, counterstrokes, and consolidation. They moved toward the end of the first week with a weary, mechanical determination, as if the body of the army had learned to walk by reflex rather than by intention. Each morning began with the same checklist: check the belts, thaw the firing pins, feed the pumps with warmed oil, count men, and distribute ammunition. Forward observers counted rounds down like candle stubs, noting how many 152 shells remained, and which batteries could no longer bring fire to bear without risking barrel failure. In villages taken and then retaken, the ground told stories in hollowed cellars and doors riddled with splinters where men had braced themselves. Pack horses were repurposed as bearers for the wounded, their flanks heaving under loads they had not been designed to carry, and the men who led them were hollowed by exhaustion. When reinforcements arrived, they did so in a twilight of unspoken knowledge. Fresh faces could neither replace the lost nor erase the strain in hardened veterans' eyes. Reports trickled up the chain of command that objectives had been partially met, but at a cost that required replenishment no depot could easily supply. And so the operation ground on, a slow mill of human will and heavy machinery, each rotation extracting more than it returned. In the churned snow, courage and futility were indistinguishable. They crawled across the slick planks like men moving on a glass river, boots scraping and breath steaming into the air. Shells stitched the afternoon sky, and every impact sent white geysers leaping beside the fragile footbridges. Lieutenant Pavlov clung to a rope handrail with numb fingers, while his men shuffled 2 by 2, rifles slung ready for the second they hit the bank. The plank spans were simple, 10 meters of pine decking lashed to pontoon drums, but under load and fire they became precarious. Each pontoon section was rated for only a few tons without reinforcement, a limit that felt mathematical and mortal when slogging across with packs and ammunition. Engineers beneath the plank worked with mallets and wire, tensioning ropes and whispering curses when joints creaked, knowing that a collapse meant men plunging into waters that would give them no mercy. The current tugged at lifebelts and boots, pulling at the heels of those who slipped and forcing swimmers under the ice to fight against an invisible hand. Above them artillery flashed, and a Katyusha volley sent a spray of orange over the far bank, momentarily illuminating faces contorted with cold and fear. Men prayed without words, mouths moving in tight lines as shells passed, and the river roared like an answer. When the first small bridge held and the first squad stumbled up the bank, there was a brief, devastated lift of hope that vanished as quickly as it had come. At dusk, rafts made from timber and empty fuel drums shuddered as groups of soldiers pushed off into the wide grey sweep of the river. What they didn't yet know was how treacherous the under-ice current could be. A subsurface torrent that gnawed at planks and pried apart lashings with patient violence. Captain Sidorov barked commands that his throat could not warm, timing departures to the thinned windows between German salvos. Men tested the raft's buoyancy by tossing on ammunition crates and watching how the flotation drums sat in the water, then shifted weight to steady the load. The rafts creaked and bent under the strain, the metal hoops groaning like old men when put to sudden labor. A midstream swell slammed a raft broadside into a submerged timber, tearing a seam and letting an icy spray that stung faces and froze beards in a staccato of pain. Soldiers fought the cold with movement, churning their legs to keep circulation in a desperate private war against frostbite. On the far bank, machine guns stuttered, then died, victims of well-aimed counter-battery fire and occasional Luftwaffe sweeps that pinned both sides to the earth. Night fell with the sound of distant engines and the soft, terrible slap of water against wood that could not promise safety. Each successful crossing was paid for in small private losses the officers tallied later, numbers that never captured the shape of grief. Engineers measured ice thickness with augers, noting millimeters of variance that could decide the fate of a platoon. A T-34, with its roughly 26 tons of steel and broad tracks, could not be floated easily on a single raft and required reinforced pontoons and a mat of planks to spread the load. Major Alexei ordered teams to lash extra drums and cross-brace the spans, knowing that a slight miscalculation of buoyancy would split wood and send tracks into the cold black. The work was physical and precise, shackles tightened by frozen hands, bolts torqued with measured pulls, and temporary ramps cut into ice to guide heavy treads ashore. Tank crews rode low, engines idling to maintain oil pressure, while cooks and mechanics fed warmed grease into bearings to prevent seizure. When a T-34 finally rolled onto a makeshift bridge, the entire structure flexed under the concentrated load, and men held their breath as if the wood itself could break faith. Downstream currents scoured the riverbed and exposed hidden sandbars that snagged floats, tilting rafts and forcing frantic counterweights that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. A single failure could strand armor midstream, its crew clinging to the turret with faces blue and eyes wide as the waters closed. Recovery attempts under fire were costly and often futile. On the bank, sappers hurried to build improvised revetments to secure lodgements and to direct tanks to firmer ground where tracks would find purchase. The river, a system of physics and weather, became a machine that both armies tried to learn and, failing that, to outmuscle at terrible cost. They prayed aloud in small groups beneath flares, an uncoordinated chorus. Orthodox murmurs, furtive Hail Marys, a soldier's whispered line from a village litany. What they didn't yet know was that prayer would not hold back the river's appetite, nor the tactic of the defenders who watched for the very noises faith made. Medics moved with a calm sharpened by trauma, hauling the wounded from slick banks and thawing hands with steam and brandy where available, patching frozen flesh with gauze and hope. A wounded man's pulse was more honest than any radio. A weak, fast pulse meant shock. A slow, thready beat meant hypothermia that could not be reversed without immediate shelter and warmth. Field dressings froze if not applied with speed, and morphine capsules clinked quietly in pockets like small sins. Medics counted them and regretted each dispense. Engineers laid canvas over exposed shelters to trap heat, but the wind found seams and pulled warmth like breath from a mouth. In a shallow cellar, a makeshift aid station had a crude register where names were written in pencil that soon smeared with condensation and blood. Nurses and orderlies worked in rotations to stave off collapse. Many were volunteers from nearby villages who had been dragged into the war by draft and necessity. As night deepened, the clinic's lanterns threw shadows that moved like sentries, and the staff mapped each injury to a story they would recount in later winters with haunted eyes. The human cost of every crossing accumulated into an arithmetic that no command could reconcile with victory. From German observation posts perched on the high bank, the crossings looked like clumsy theatre, men shuttling over thin bridges and rafts that seemed too vulnerable for their own audacity. Observation officers recorded paddles and lanterns on notched maps with meticulousness, noting exact bearings and the timing of movements to pass to artillery. Oberleutnant Becker adjusted his glass and called for targeted fire, aiming to break a raft's prow or to send a salvo that would lift men from wood into water. The 7.92 mmMG 34 teams were positioned to rake approaches, their belts fed with cold oiled cartridges that still cycled under frost because maintenance had been drilled into the crews. Flak units shifted their aim to low trajectories when the Luftwaffe could not provide continuous cover, converting anti-air guns into suppressive fire for riverbanks. In some sectors, German engineers laid obstacles of submerged stakes and rigged tripwires beneath the ice, designed to tear at ankles and snag boots, turning the river's edge into a paring knife. Prisoners captured later spoke of the efficiency with which defenders coordinated mine-laying with direct fire, a choreography that seemed to anticipate each Soviet move. Yet not all Germans were untroubled. Supply shortages and the fatigue of rotating units showed on faces as they hauled frozen stretchers into field ambulances. Even the defenders knew that victory at a riverbank was often only provisional. A night's success could be washed away by weather or counterthrust. Still, in those hours, their calculations worked, and the crossings took on the feel of a campaign fought as much against geography as against the enemy. Reinforcements were promised from rear depots, but arrived in trickles because rail bottlenecks and sabotaged lines slowed movement to a crawl. No one imagined this would become a campaign of attrition defined by the slow, grinding arrival of men and material rather than by swift, decisive blows. When trucks did arrive, their loads were piecemeal: a few crates of ammunition, a drum of fuel, a package of insulated boots, essentials that would be rationed and argued over at every command post. Engineers attempted to build more permanent pontoon bridges by night, hauling prefabricated sections that required teams of 20 men each to rest into place, while spotters watched for flare shadows. Each reinforced span took hours to emplace, and often a single misaligned joint meant returning to shore to reposition, a delay that invited enemy fire. Supply officers improvised caches in wooded gullies, masking them with branches while cooks set stoves nearby to keep the water from freezing. Fuel conservation became as tactical as ammunition rationing. In one rear depot, a dispatcher named Anna smuggled extra blankets into a column's load, an act of small mercy that saved half a dozen men from frostbite later that week. The trickle of reinforcements changed the tempo of engagements but could not erase the fatigue already carved into units, nor the psychological toll of watching comrades go under. When a Wehrmacht counter-battery found a supply route, entire convoys could be pinned for hours, and the loss of a single fuel drum might immobilize a battery of artillery. In the calculus of survival, logistics proved the stern arbiter of whether courage translated into sustained action. By the fifth day, command decisions hardened into grim resolve: hold the bridgeheads at any cost, or withdraw and concede hard-won ground. Captain Sidorov chose to press on with a mixed force of infantry and two T-34s, despite reports of a fresh German company moving to intercept. Believing that speed would trump consolidation, men cheered quietly as the tanks rolled, a sound half celebration and half lament. But the ground under them betrayed that hope as the T-34's tracks slipped into a thawed bog less than 300 meters from the bank. Recovery crews attempted to snatch the immobilized tank with winches and stout ropes, but each attempt drew artillery that bracketed the position and shredded recovery gear. The immobilized armor became an anchor, slowing supply wagons and exposing men who tried to salvage parts, and within hours the position was a focal point for enemy fire. Sapper teams attempted to dig in around the stranded hull, building earthworks that would take hours and human energy the front line could ill afford. When night came, the stranded crew huddled inside, engines idling to keep warm and listening to the water lap and the distant rumble of enemy movements. Messages sent back to division headquarters asked for extraction and reinforcements. The replies came hours later, offering alternative plans that were already obsolete. The choice to press, rather than withdraw, became a lens through which losses multiplied, each delay cascading into more casualties and a longer supply tail. Small decisions compounded into collapse when calculators of command could not account for the river's appetite and the enemy's patience. As dawn broke on the sixth day, those who had survived the crossings looked like people who had been passed through a machine and softened by it. No one imagined this would become a bitter ledger of names and frozen boots, rather than the triumphant tale the orders had promised. Corps commanders tallied effective men and counted the empty berths where comrades had once dozed, and their faces carried the arithmetic of regret. Sentries on the far bank watched for movement with binoculars rimmed in white, while engineers reinforced the last spans with sandbags and saplings. The river kept its pace, unmoved by flags or doctrine, and the men who had challenged it discovered its indifference. In the afterglow of fighting, survivors gathered around scant fires and swapped stories that were halting and stitched with humor, the small human attempt to repair what war had torn. Medics closed the creases of uniforms over unnamed forms, recording what they could and leaving other tasks to later seasons when thaw and quiet allowed. Commanders filed reports with a language of partial success and heavy loss. Phrases meant more for Moscow's ears than for the men who had frozen on the shore. The crossings would be remembered as feats of endurance and as failures of calculation, a duality that history would argue over long after the snow melted. The river took more men than the enemy did, but both demanded the same toll. Wheels bit into frozen mud as the first reconnaissance Yak 1 shoved forward, its canopy rimmed with hoarfrost and the Klimov engine coughing to life at idling revolutions. Ground crews slapped varnished propellers with gloved hands, feeling the vibration that meant the M105P would warm and deliver its 1,100 horsepower to the air. Mechanics counted compression and kept an ear for knocks that augured failure. Captain Sergei Ivanenko taxied to the threshold and glanced at the sky, where a thin smear of cloud hid the sun and turned metal into cold silver. Behind him, in a battered German Feldflugplatz, Oberfeldwebel Kraus watched his FD-189's twin BMW engines tick as oil thickened in the nacelles, and he muttered the maintenance hymns of men who knew how winter killed machines slowly. They climbed through the low overcast at 3,000 to 4,000 meters when visibility allowed, the air-biting instrument faces and frosting pitot tubes if they lingered too long. From above, the Salient looked like a cluster of black wounds on white skin, and both sides' pilots radioed calm reports that were measured in kilometers and altitudes, not in the lives below. A spotter's camera clicked. The negative would later show tanks as tiny beetles and plumes of smoke like ink on paper. Engines screamed when they dove, and the roar translated immediately into fear on the ground, where soldiers craned necks toward thin silhouettes. For a few terrible hours, the sky ruled the scene below with the cold logic of altitude and speed, and men prayed to gods who lived in machine and metal. What they didn't yet know was how much that dominance would hinge on fuel, parts, and the brittle chains of supply that shivered in winter's teeth. Luftwaffe formations came in measured waves, Me-109, SES slicing the air, and Ju-87S riding toward targets with the awful dignity of falling birds. Their DB-605 engines delivered bursts of power that could run a dive from 6,000 meters and convert altitude into destructive speed. Soviet fighters countered where they could, clinging to the lower strata where the yak's agility might matter, but the tally of spare parts and trained mechanics favored the Germans in this sector. Ground observers trained their rangefinders and plotted tracks, passing bearings to flak batteries that adjusted fuse settings to bring shells to the proper time of burst. An 88 round timed correctly could turn airspace into a lattice of shrapnel. Each lost aircraft had effects that rippled inward. A downed reconnaissance plane meant delayed coordinates, which meant artillery could not bracket with precision, and that absence translated into exposed infantry. Maintenance tents filled with men who worked by lantern and hope, replacing spark plugs, straightening bent frames, and gossiping in short, worn voices about pilots who never came back. On the ground, soldiers looked upward for salvation and saw instead a calculus of altitude, fuel, and the brittle health of engines. The sky's supremacy was physical, measurable, and conditional, a factor that could be won and lost like a village or a bridge. No one imagined this would become a theater, where small mechanical failures decided battles as surely as doctrine once had. On a morning thick with low fog, a Ju-87's hydraulics froze mid-stall, and the Stuka slipped a wing into the snow, its siren stilled by impact. The pilot's last view was of white, and the cold that pried open broken metal. Nearby, a yak with a fouled magneto limped back to base, and the pilot nursed his engine through a glide that felt like bargaining with fate. He landed with his hands shaking, and a silence that replaced the usual swagger of debriefing. Reconnaissance that day was patchy. Targets once clear became outlines in drifting smoke, and artillery that depended on updated aerial photos fired on coordinates that were hours stale. The effect was immediate. Barrages missed by tens of meters, infantry exposed to pre-registered German guns, and supply columns left to crawl under the watch of air observers who could no longer see them. Mechanics learned to keep engines idling even when not ordered, to wrap carburetor intakes with cloth, to run priming pumps in a low rhythm to stave off congealing fuel. The relationship between the sky and the ground hardened into cause and effect. If the sky could not see, the earth suffered. If the earth could not move, the sky wasted sorties hunting shadows. Pilots and ground crews developed a mutual, bitter respect for the way weather turned the most sophisticated machine into a fragile, human-warmed thing. What they didn't yet know was how the Luftwaffe's temporary supremacy would shape the tempo of ground fighting for days to come. German bombing and strafing runs punctured supply routes and turned open fields into places to avoid. The June 88s carried ordnance that could punch through corrugated metal and rip apart the canvas sides of ammunition wagons. In response, Soviet commanders moved supply under cover of night and buried trucks under branches, masking their heat signatures and trying to confuse aerial reconnaissance. Air crews became artists of evasion, approaches at odd angles, using thermals to break lock, and coordination with flak to provide safe corridors for vulnerable transports. Observation posts on both sides used binoculars and simple theodolites to triangulate targets and relay positions, producing a lattice of information that fed both guns and crafts. In one sector, Lieutenant Kruger watched as a Soviet supply column folded into a forested ravine and then disappear from his sight, an instance of fieldcraft that forced him to adjust altitude and angle lest he waste a bomb on empty ground. The technical specifics mattered: fuse settings to prevent ricochet, propeller RPM management to reduce engine strain in thin air, and the precise loadout of bombs versus machine gun ammo determined the effect on the front. The Sky's War became a set of small interlocking trades between pilots and observers, each decision cascading into the fortunes of the men below. Above all, the air war added a vertical pressure to the horizontal grind already tearing the salient. No one imagined this would be merely a story of machines. It would be a theater of human lives balanced on fragile metal. In a frozen field, a downed German pilot named Heinrich crawled from a burning Fiel 190 and was taken prisoner by a group of Soviet infantry who had never seen a man from the air up close. They measured him not with bullets but with suspicion and a kind of weary curiosity. A Soviet navigator, Maria Petrovna, logged coordinates with trembling fingers after a reconnaissance sortie, her hand numb from altitude and adrenaline, then crawled to sleep like a small animal until the next alarm. Ground crews kept a ledger of aircraft lost to flak and to mechanical failure, punctured oil lines, scorched magnetos, shattered prop hubs, each entry a small bell toll in the rear. Luftwaffe ground echelon men tore canvas open to retrieve instruments from burning frames, salvaging gyro compasses and altimeters like priests collecting relics. In the quiet hours between raids, pilots traded cigarettes and stories across no man's patches of front, acknowledging shared risk even as they represented opposite flags. Those exchanges softened the war's edges for a moment, but then orders and doctrine drove them back into the geometry of battle. Above all, the human element revealed that mastery of the sky depended on a network of technicians, fuel wagons, and the endurance of men who worked in the half-light of frozen hangars. What they didn't yet know was how a single well-timed sortie could deny an army the breath it needed to fight the next day. An early morning bombing that cratered a main road turned a supply schedule into improvisation. Trucks rerouted into forests, losing hours while drivers found passable tracks. That delay meant less fuel for a battery of 122 guns, which in turn meant reduced suppression for a planned infantry push, and the planned push faltered under precise German fire. Such sequences repeated with wearying regularity. An aerial interdiction produced immediate logjams on the ground, and the algebra of attrition grew steeper. Commanders learned to watch the sky as closely as they watched maps. A clear horizon meant a day of danger, while low clouds offered a fragile, weather-dependent respite. Pilots adapted too, flying lower when needed, accepting the increased flak in exchange for the tactical effect of disrupting supplies. Observers kept records, time over target, ordnance used, and the enemy's immediate reaction that later informed decisions about where to risk scarce sorties. The air war became less a spectacle of dogfights and more a strategic hand pressing on the neck of logistics, and its pressure could not be ignored. By twilight the air cooled, and engines died to a ragged rhythm. Mechanics walked the line of aircraft, like sentinels checking cooling jugs and spark plugs with lanterns that threw long trembling shadows. Pilots removed gloves and rubbed fingers raw from the cold and from the visceral work of holding a machine between life and death, their faces hollowed by altitude and the sight of burning fields. In the hangars, tools were set aside, and men whispered names of lost comrades, and the air smelled of oil, cordite, and the faint sweetness of burned fabric. Observation logs were filed and sent to commanders, who would fold the day's meteor and mechanical facts into new plans: when to attack, where to conserve, and how to marshal the fragile resource of flight hours. Flight nurses checked the injured, who returned on wheels, shrapnel wounds, frostbite, and the odd case of a pilot who had survived a crash only to be blind with cold and concussion. Pilots drank black tea from tin cups, scraped frost from helmets, and wrote terse notes for intelligence that had to be read and acted upon before dawn. The sky had been a place of power for a time, and it had lent its cold light to both triumphs and losses. The machines hummed and creaked like tired beasts in the dark. Above the storm of men, the sky burned cold and bright, a theatre of ghosts. They pushed through waist-high drifts with gloved hands, raw from rope and rifle wood, and the first sight that stopped them was a line of shapes half buried at the forest edge, helmets forming a pale, silent semaphore against the pines. Men who had been alive at dawn lay like the fallen limbs of trees, faces crusted with ice and mouths open to the grey air. Sergeant Dmitry Fedorov counted them, and then looked away, because counting felt like giving the dead a name he could not bear. Snow settled on the hems of great coats, as if trying to make the scene neat, and boot prints trailed off into nothing where men had tried to drag comrades to shelter. A field radio sent a short formal message upstream: casualties exceeded estimates, request immediate evacuation priority for battlefield surgery. Medics moved like ghosts between trunks, their lanterns throwing halos that trembled with each distant concussion, binding shoulders and stuffing scarves into mouths to stop bleeding that would congeal into little black rivers of ice. A horse-drawn cart ground to a halt in a hollow, its driver staring at the frozen team that had once pulled it, the harness stiff and useless. The wood's muffled sound, except where shell fire punched through canopy and ground alike, and then the silence resumed as if trying to swallow the noise whole. Men argued quietly whether to bury bodies now or mark them for spring. The answer was practical and cruel. The cold made digging almost impossible. In one shallow grave, they wrapped a fallen comrade's watch in cloth and left it like a promise. Later, a sapper would pry open a shuttered tooth and find the metal frozen solid. The forest took names slowly and without malice, and those who remained felt small against the strict geometry of ice and tree. What they didn't yet know was how many of those shapes marked not a moment of heroism, but the arithmetic of miscommunication. A missed withdrawal order here, a misdirected barrage there, and men were buried by the consequences of motion and error. In a shallow trench, Lieutenant Arkady glanced at his frozen map and traced the hour when his company had been told to advance. His mouth tasted of metal, and the news that 2 supporting batteries had been delayed. The delay made the movement intelligible to anyone with experience. Suppression lifted too early. The enemy's flanking fire opened, and columns that moved in daylight became visible targets. Sappers cursed over tripwires, and improvised mines, learning that in frost the mechanisms behaved unpredictably, pressure plates that would not trigger in thaw, and then detonated when a later step compressed brittle ice into motion. A medic named Tanya recorded wounds by number and by story, shrapnel in the thigh that never hit bone, frostbite that ate toes from the foot up, and concussions that turned men into slow shadows of themselves. Soldiers who had survived 3 days described the sensation of living in a body that had been audited to emptiness. Appetite gone, sleep scarce, fear stowed in the small compartment of habit. Across no man's land, German patrols reported similar scenes in their logs, noting the waste that even victory required and the cost of holding ground that the weather resented. Commanders on both sides received reports and then dictated new orders as if paper could repair flesh. The woods listened and did not answer. No one imagined this would become a ledger of private tragedies that bureaucrats would summarize with neat columns and blunt phrases. To those at the front, the statistics were people. Corporal Yevgeny, a baker before conscription, wept quietly when he found a photograph pinned to a frozen coat. A woman and a child smiling in summer light, and wrapped the image in oilcloth as if it might preserve the face. Around him, men traded small comforts like currency, a tobacco pouch for a canteen of warm tea, a knitted cap for a ration of chocolate. These exchanges kept morale flickering in a wind that would snuff it. Nurses stitched and stapled, and when that failed, wrapped ice with boiled cloth to slow the necrosis, improvising with a calm that made the act seem almost ordinary. The field hospital overflowed. Cots lined every available floor, and men lay shoulder to shoulder, the wounded counting heartbeats and the living counting rations. A surgeon named Dr. Korsakov moved through the rows with deliberate hands, deciding which limb to save and which to lose, and the choices were precise and brutal. When a lull allowed, bodies were gathered into rows and marked with what could be found: a scrap of cloth, a boot turned to show the name sewn into its leather, a pencil-sketched number on a mitten. In the darkness between shelling, soldiers read aloud letters they had carried for weeks, the small comforts of home sounding like contraband in the icy air. The human fabric of the units thinly frayed as replacements arrived, unseasoned and pale, who sometimes could not bear the sight of comrades stiff with frost. The woods continued to take more than they returned. What they didn't yet know was how the emotional geography of exhaustion would shape action as much as terrain. Grief turned toward a practical end, and survival hardened into a new form of discipline. Men learned to bury quickly and to carry on immediately, because the lull would not last and the enemy would not permit long ceremonies. Officers instituted short, formal rites at dawn, a moment to name the dead, a quick prayer, and an order to move on, as if ritual could be condensed into the logistics of war. A battalion chaplain, Father Anatoly, read a prayer that felt small and necessary, his voice swallowed by the forest as if the trees were part of a larger congregation that could not speak back. Rations were redistributed by courier and by rank, and the smallest kindness, an extra blanket, a warmed tin of sweet porridge, became a moral ballast. Medical officers prioritized those with salvageable life, and left the rest to the winter, noting their names in ledgers that would be sent home or filed away. Letters home were written by those who could, quick lines that tried to turn the landscape into narrative. Mother, sister, we are well enough. We fight. The weather is cruel. The evolution from panic to procedure was not comfort. It was necessity, and the men accepted it with the mute resignation of those whose world had been narrowed to tasks. The woods watched and took note of these small adaptations and made them ordinary. In dressing wounds and burying friends, the soldiers built a scaffolding of endurance out of grief. No one imagined this would become a season of moral ambiguity, where the small acts of care were indistinguishable from tactical calculation. When night dropped and frost crystallized on branches like lace, patrols left with the lamplight of purpose and returned with silence that carried stories. A reconnaissance patrol, led by Sergeant Mikhail, slipped along a deer trail and found a German dugout whose occupants had frozen in sleep. They took rations and the humiliation of discovery, then debated whether to leave the dugout intact to deceive others. The decision to burn or to spare, to bury or to ignore, became part of daily calculus. Choices that had consequences not only for morale, but for security. Medics sometimes chose to wake a dying man with little hope, if his information might prevent an ambush. The humane and the tactical blurred into a single necessary action. Letters written in that time would later be read as testimony to endurance, but in the moment they were pragmatic acts, meant to reassure a mother and to reduce a unit's psychological load. Commanders who ordered counterattacks did so with faces that bore the strain of having seen the forest claim friends. Their obedience to higher orders felt both dutiful and resigned. The woods absorbed these acts and returned nothing but silence. The men who remained learned not to ask for moral clarity, because war did not offer it. Instead, they sought small certainties, a sentry's watch, a ration still left in a sack, the warmth of a comrade's breath through the night. What they didn't yet know was how quickly the front's narrative would move from the immediate to the bureaucratic, from the tender particulars to the cold columns of dispatches. Headquarters received reports that condensed hours into bullet points, casualties, positions held, enemy activity, and requests for reinforcement. A language that flattened faces into numbers. A division staff clerk named Irina transcribed casualty lists into form after form, her pencil scratching the names that would later be carved into memorials and sometimes misread in the haste of filing. These clerical acts seemed at once mundane and sacred. The fidelity of her lists might decide whether a family ever knew where a son had fallen. Military bureaucracy moved to reconcile the chaos into order, issuing directives to consolidate lines and to rotate units, words that filtered down to men who had no energy left for arguments about strategy. In the field, platoons received new orders to withdraw slightly and form a second line. The movement had the sting of retreat, but the prudence of preservation. Men packed what they could and left the rest, marking graves with crude cairns and improvised crosses at the base of pines. The forest watched them leave and then stood bare and indifferent under the knife of winter, its creaks like a ledger closing. The forest no longer echoed with orders, only with the slow creak of trees bending beneath snow. The phone crackled with static as snow hissed against the window of the command hut. General Georgy Zhukov sat hunched over a map whose edges were stiff with frost and coffee stains, his gloved finger tracing lines that no longer existed in the real world. The table was littered with casualty sheets, penciled estimates of divisions that had ceased to exist as coherent units, tens of thousands reduced to the arithmetic of attrition. His staff waited in silence, boots wet, eyes dull from nights without sleep. One colonel tried to speak, then stopped. Another shifted papers without purpose, pretending that logistics could still catch up to geography. Zhukov finally lifted the receiver and demanded updates from the Kalinin front, his tone clipped and exacting, though each word carried the brittle edge of disbelief. "Continue offensive pressure," he ordered, as if repetition itself could thaw the lines. On the wall, a portrait of Stalin watched from the shadowed corner, the mustache like a seal over a mouth that would never speak mercy. The men around Zhukov took notes without comment, their pencils moving like tired metronomes marking time for an orchestra that no longer played. The storm outside, muted all sound but that of the pencil scratching paper, the slow erosion of confidence made audible. What they didn't yet know was how much of this insistence came from fear rather than conviction. The radio from Moscow transmitted orders couched in the language of encirclement, breakthrough, and decisive blow, but those phrases had begun to sound like relics from a season that had already passed. Frontline dispatches told another story: bridges shattered, battalions isolated, hospitals beyond capacity. Zhukov's deputy, General Konov, drafted a memorandum urging a temporary halt for regrouping, but when he read it aloud, his voice faltered under the weight of his own caution. "The Supreme Commander demands results," Zhukov replied, almost quietly, as if reciting a rule of physics. Outside, the generator coughed, its sputtering light flickering across faces drawn taut with resignation. A messenger arrived carrying the day's situation report. 2 pages of numbers, but the numbers no longer aligned with the orders on the board. Zhukov studied the figures, and then simply folded them, as though folding could erase what they contained. The room's air thickened with unspoken truth. The offensive was bleeding to death, and no one dared call it by its name. Command persisted, because obedience had momentum of its own. No one imagined this would become the defining image of the Rzhev campaign, maps covered in erasure marks and rewritten arrows chasing ghosts. The staff officers used soft pencils because the paper wore thin from correction. Each change meant another battalion lost, another regiment reclassified as combat ineffective. The maps themselves looked exhausted, their creases blackened by soot from the stove. A junior adjutant, Lieutenant Pavlenko, stared at the clutter of colored pins, trying to locate his brother's division. He found the symbol, a small blue flag near the Osuga River, and wondered if the reality behind it still existed. Report after report confirmed what no one wanted to admit. Breakthroughs had stalled, armor reserves were bogged down, and reinforcements from the Bryansk front were days too late. Yet the orders continued: counter-battery fire, flanking maneuver, renewed assault. In the calculus of command, action was life, inaction was treason. The room became an echo chamber of logic, folding into itself. Maps glowed faintly under the lamplight, beautiful in their precision and tragic in their distance from the truth they described. What they didn't yet know was how close the command structure itself was to collapse, not from mutiny but from fatigue that dulled decision into reflex. The staff doctor, Major Biryukov, made rounds with caffeine tablets and morphine syringes, the twin alchemies of endurance. He measured pulse rates, issued reprimands for fainting, and quietly removed 2 officers from duty after breakdowns that left them staring blankly at the stove for hours. The radio operators rotated shifts, their headsets leaving red circles on their temples, transmitting messages whose meaning blurred from repetition: advance, hold, reinforce, report losses. Beyond the walls, truck engines idled, gears grinding as mechanics tried to coax life from machines frozen solid. A captain read aloud the latest weather forecast, temperatures dropping below -20, and the silence that followed felt like a verdict. Orders were issued to push artillery forward despite the frost, as if metal could defy thermodynamics by decree. The phone rang again, Moscow's distant voice repeating the same demand for results. Zhukov's jaw tightened. "We proceed," he said, though the words sounded like ritual rather than conviction. No one imagined that the persistence would become its own weapon, blunt, heavy, indiscriminate. Divisions rotated out of line at half strength, their replacements already worn before the first assault. Supply officers noted fuel shortages and requested permission to cannibalize vehicles, converting 1 truck from 3 to keep the lifeline breathing. At night, the staff tents flickered with lamp oil, while clerks compiled casualty tallies by candlelight, the names dissolving into abstraction with each new entry. Zhukov read the summaries without expression, his face illuminated in intervals by flame and shadow, his thoughts unreadable even to himself. Commanders began to mask despair behind precision, grid references, supply tonnage, ammunition allotments, a bureaucratic armor against the emotional truth of failure. The operational clock ticked forward, each day marked by diminishing returns, yet the rhythm itself offered comfort. Movement implied purpose, and purpose excused suffering. Even as reports arrived of regiments annihilated to the last man, the High Command issued orders for another push to exploit local success. The irony was structural. The machinery of command could not stop without betraying its own premise. The offensive was now an organism sustained by inertia and pride. What they didn't yet know was that Zhukov's resolve, once his genius, had hardened into its opposite. His genius had always been movement, decisive, unsentimental, relentless. But at Rzhev movement had met an immovable enemy: terrain, weather, and attrition. Every delay multiplied loss, every insistence cost another 100 men, and still he believed that pressure would force results. The belief was not madness, it was faith in a logic that had worked before, at Yelnya, at Moscow, and soon at Stalingrad. But faith, like steel, could grow brittle. Kolnev's second appeal for suspension arrived late one evening, its tone carefully phrased to suggest reason rather than rebellion. Zhukov read it, then quietly placed it aside and said, "Tell him to execute as planned." The aide nodded, knowing the futility of argument. The phone rang again, and again Zhukov answered, his voice flat, his words unchanged. Beyond the hut, the wind keened across the steppe, a sound as old as war itself. Inside, the last illusion of momentum dissolved into the steady rhythm of denial. No one imagined that the end would come not with decision but with exhaustion, so profound it became indistinguishable from acceptance. By mid-December, attacks had slowed to local skirmishes, each one costing lives measured against meters of snow and wire. Communications faltered, fuel froze, and men dug in rather than advanced. The staff logged fewer orders, fewer calls, as if the offensive were ending not by command, but by attrition of will. Zhukov no longer spoke in full sentences. He gestured, nodded, pointed, his thoughts stripped to the language of continuation. The portrait on the wall seemed to watch in judgment as reports piled unread beneath it, the paper curling from the heat of the stove. Outside, the muffled sound of artillery had lost its rhythm. The battle no longer moved, it simply existed. Inside, officers dozed at their posts, pens slipping from fingers, the silence broken only by the scrape of pencils and the faint rattle of the phone line. Even genius can freeze in winter, and ambition becomes indistinguishable from obsession. They pushed through morning mist as a Kampfgruppe tore along a frozen track toward a gap scouts, had marked panzer engines roaring like beasts waking from slumber. The Pays KPFW-4s and Stugs moved in measured intervals, their Maybach power plants spooling up and delivering bursts of torque that chewed ice and turf with a mechanical insistence. Oberleutnant Franz Berger peered from his command cupola, feeling every shudder as suspension took a rut, and the vehicle rated its weight against frost. Flares arced into the grey and pinned down the shadows where Soviet infantry had tried to consolidate, turning movement into a silhouette of risk. Machine gun crews readied belts of 7.92 mm rounds, while panzer grenadiers braced with entrenching tools in hand, poised to exploit any breach. Coordination between armor, infantry and artillery worked like cold clockwork: punch the flank, force reserves to commit, then roll through the gap. Radio chatter was clipped, call signs, grid coordinates, and terse orders that meant life or death in measured syllables. A platoon of pioneers followed to shore up captured track with fascines and baskets so supply wagons could pass. When the first Soviet T-30 force appeared, they were already firing into a prepared arc of anti-tank fire the Germans had pre-registered. The result was immediate. A T-34 burned with a dull black roar as concentrated 50 mm and 75 mm hits found vulnerable seams. On the ridge, artillery observers adjusted fall of shot, and 88 mm and 105 mm pieces created lethal brackets where Soviet lodgements had formed, each crater altering approach routes and channeling movement. Shells punched into snowbanks and tore open seams in forward positions, forcing attackers into predictable funnels that machine gun teams exploited with disciplined bursts. Sergeant Wilhelm Hartmann called in mortar concentrations to deny a farmhouse that had become a Soviet strongpoint, and the combined fires carved lanes the attackers could not cross. Anti-tank units held fire until the decisive moment, and then engaged with a measured accuracy honed by defensive drills of a year past. Soviet infantry, exposed and depleted, found themselves bunched and vulnerable to combined arms maneuvers they had been taught to fear. A counterattack that began as a probing action hardened into a concerted blow and pushed the front back a few hundred meters. For German soldiers, the push felt like vindication, proof that Model's doctrine of elastic defense and timely local counterstrokes could still work. Radios reported captured equipment and prisoners, and the mood at the front was raw, bitter, and for a time triumphant. Reports filtered back to headquarters in terse, efficient language that reframed setbacks as managed losses. What they didn't yet know was that this success would cost resources and lives that could not be fully replenished in a prolonged war of attrition. In the Soviet lines, Colonel Mikolov watched the German counterblows unfold with a mixture of disbelief and grim calculation, ordering immediate redistribution of anti-tank guns and mobilizing fragile reserves. Those reserves were thin. Many units reported fuel shortages and immobilized tractors that turned reinforcement into improvisation. T-34 crews attempted to close with German armor, but terrain funneled them into defiladed approaches where frontal armor could be targeted by concentrated fire. From German observation posts, men cheered as Soviet armor caught flame and crews bailed into snow, their silhouettes stark against orange fires. The emotional contrast was brutal. Jubilation at a successful defense on one side, stunned silence of loss on the other. Engineers on both sides worked feverishly, Germans reinforcing roadbeds, while both sides improvised anti-tank ditches when soil allowed. Artillery logs recorded dozens of rounds expended to break lodgements that had taken Soviets hours to win, an arithmetic of expense that would shape the coming weeks. Chaplains and medics scrambled to retrieve the wounded and to tend to burns and shrapnel injuries sustained under concentrated anti-tank barrages. The tactile realities of firepower, penetration angles, spalled inside turrets, the bitter heat of burning engines, replaced doctrine in the minds of men who now counted rounds and breaths. The counterbite had stabilized the sector, but it would not erase the memory of losses already paid. Reinforcement convoys moved under Luftwaffe escort, half-tracks clattering and towing spare barrels, track repair sections, and fuel that the front sorely needed. The air cover allowed engineers to work on bridges and deliver quick repairs that kept supply routes minimally functional, but every convoy consumed fuel and ammunition that might otherwise have bolstered other threatened sectors. Oberfeldwebel Krause noted the tale of every spare part, a broken torsion bar, a replacement idler sprocket, a welded track link that would hold only so long, and he worried at night about longevity. The German logistical machine, efficient though it was, showed strain as units consumed more than depot estimates predicted for a winter campaign. Supply trains queued at railheads, where snowdrifts narrowed tracks to a single usable line, and shunting operations took hours longer than timetables allowed. Frontline units tended wounded in provisional shelters, faces lit by the red glow of burn pits where vehicles smoldered. On the Soviet side, political officers wrote terse bulletins that omitted the pain of retreat and emphasized heroism and sacrifice instead. Men who had fought earlier assaults watched the counterblows with stoic acceptance, aware tactical setbacks were part of a larger grind. The small victories tasted of survival and produced new demands for men and material that would compound quickly. No one imagined this would become a war of resources as much as a war of tactics, where the ability to repair, fuel, and replace would dictate the shape of victory. At dawn, medics crawled through fog to carry wounded from shell-blasted hedgerows to field dressings, stretchers sagging with weight and the damp of snow. Teams moved with disciplined slowness to avoid jostling fragile lungs, and triage was immediate and brutal. Morphine to steady tourniquets for arterial wounds, and heat where it could be spared. A German Feldwebel supervised triage in a snowbound barn, morphine ampoules rationed and splints fashioned from broom handles, while Soviet nurses boiled bandages over sputtering Primus stoves. Both sides improvised antiseptic dilution to stretch dwindling supplies, and tourniquets became a grimly familiar sight. The smell of burned fabric mixed with iodine and diesel as medics worked, while artillery punched holes through sky and gravity answered with cratered ground. Casualty estimates rose faster than replacements could be trained, and the human cost outstripped commanders' appetite for risk. Soldiers whispered names into the cold and made crude markers to remember where comrades lay, small acts that defied the official record. In some units, men cheered when enemy armor was dragged off, because that sight eased their ache, if only for a moment. The scale of loss carried on shoulders and in the quiet of tents turned celebration into a brief pause between duties. The human ledger grew heavier with every convoy and every burst of flares. Model's operational logs recorded the counterblows as disciplined and effective, praising the elasticity of defense that had bled the attack and restored front stability. Dispatches from 9th Army headquarters described pockets cleared, supply points secured, and prisoners taken, framing tactical successes in neat, efficient prose. Beneath that sheen the army felt friction, barrels overheated, crews shortened by casualties, and winter maintenance took its toll on every vehicle. Mechanized units reported wear on gearboxes and sagging torsion bars, repair teams working through nights to keep panzers moving despite the cold. Reserve formations were called forward and then held, their presence bought at the cost of other sectors' vulnerability. German commanders mused privately that such victories must be managed carefully. Each local success dug a deeper demand for men and material. Veterans celebrated with cigarettes and nods, but acknowledged the price was high. Newspapers in Berlin lauded the stability of the front, while field grease and mud wrote a different story. Officers who had fought earlier campaigns recognized the pattern. Tactical triumphs could become strategic traps if costs were not accounted for. What they didn't yet know was how long those reserves could be sustained before the larger weight of war shifted advantage elsewhere. Small celebrations broke out among German infantry, who had watched Soviet armor burn, a raw, stoic joy shared in quiet clusters as men clasped gloved hands and took a bitter draught of warmth. Officers issued commendations in folded notes, sliding praise to NCOs who had earned it in brutal minutes of combat, and men accepted this recognition with the reserved gratitude of those who have survived. In huts and dugouts, There were sober talks about replacements and the need to rotate companies before exhaustion set in. Triumph came with an immediate practical aftercare. Soviet commanders paced maps in dim light, trying to account for gaps and reassign depleted brigades to plug holes with what they had. Konov and others debated whether to mount small counterthrusts or consolidate and rebuild in depth, the strategic forks visible, but the resources wanting. Political officers prepared statements to be sent up the chain, curated narratives that emphasize resilience over retreat, to protect morale and the larger political story. War correspondents who reached the lines sketched burned armor and resolute soldiers. Their dispatches, later edited, would serve different purposes for different audiences. Men who had fired the decisive rounds carried the memory of flame and metal, a private triumph that sat uneasily beside loss. Commanders understood that tactical resilience preserved more than ground. It preserved political narratives that would shape decisions in Moscow and Berlin alike. In the frozen dawn, victory tasted of smoke and silence. Staff officers compiled reports to forward to higher echelons in Berlin and to the Wehrmacht General Staff in occupied Europe, documents that emphasized stabilized sectors and localized tactical success. In Berlin, the reports were accepted with relief, tempered by knowledge of other, more strained fronts, where men and material were thin. The political apparatus used the counterbites to bolster morale at home and to deflect attention from setbacks elsewhere, dispatching headlines that framed the day as disciplined victory. Photographs of soldiers near burning tanks were printed with captions praising discipline and sacrifice beneath patriotic slogans, while families received censored telegrams hinting at success, but omitting the scale of loss. Field cemeteries took shape as crosses were set, and names recorded with the best care available, small acts of dignity in a machinery that otherwise consumed people like fuel. For men who had fired the decisive rounds, the memory of flame would be visceral and lasting. Public narratives could not erase the private toll. Commanders recognized that the counterbite had bought time and political capital, but that time always had a price. Decisions made in the warmth of staff tents would ripple into freezing forests and blurred casualty lists. The front held for now, paid for in blood and metal, the ledger would be tallied in months and decades. In the frozen dawn, victory tasted of smoke and silence. A courier closed the heavy Kremlin door behind him and stomped snow from his boots before slipping into a corridor where portraits watched like patient jurors. The envelope in his hand contained another field report, red-lined with numbers that made no promise of triumph. In a small office, a young adjutant named Yuri placed the paper on a heap of similar dossiers and hesitated, feeling the odd intimacy of secrecy. The act of setting a bad report aside was almost ceremonial. Down the hallway, a radio studio glowed. Technicians adjusted valves in old transmitters, while announcers read scripts that praised the heroics at Stalingrad in sonorous, practiced cadences. The tone in Moscow was controlled warmth, victories highlighted, failings minimized, and the public fed a narrative stitched from triumphs that the front could not mimic. Stalin's portrait hung in the meeting room, where a small circle of Politburo aides discussed dispatches from both fronts. They spoke in clipped phrases and shared glances like people who had rehearsed grief into policy. A stenographer recorded the minutes with a pencil that trembled when the word Rzhev appeared, as if the name itself might crack the glass of the room. Orders were drafted that emphasized reinforcement for successful sectors and buried the harsh arithmetic of losses in bureaucratic language. In the corridors, clerks burned duplicate notes that might embarrass the state and folded originals into files stamped top secret. The machinery of state spun reports into slogans and kept the harsher truths in the drawers. What they didn't yet know was how much selective attention would redraw history in the months to come. The focus on Stalingrad warmed propaganda and chilled scrutiny elsewhere. Inside the Kremlin, a deputy read aloud the latest radio bulletin and then crossed out a passage that mentioned setbacks, substituting instead a fuller description of heroism in the south. Commanders who had been promised resources for Rzhev found their requisitions rerouted to operations that fed the Stalingrad narrative, and supply chiefs like Commissar Ivanov had to explain ration allocations with the mechanical logic of spreadsheets. The effect was immediate at the front: fewer trucks, thinner ammunition allotments, and delayed reinforcements, each delay a small decision that compounded with terrible arithmetic. Political officers in the field were instructed to emphasize morale and victory in speeches, to explain attrition as necessary sacrifice, and to align local failures with national heroism. In one radio room, a young announcer named Lena rehearsed lines about the bravery of the Southern Front and paused when asked to mention Rzhev only as a footnote. The choice to amplify one story and hush another was not merely rhetorical, it redirected trains, wagons, and the very oxygen of logistical life. A minister sent a curt cable: priorities shift, support where the people hear victory. Thus policy bent the map as surely as any tank thrust might. No one imagined this would become a deliberate architecture of forgetting where bureaucratic convenience met political theatre. At headquarters, officers quietly removed failed reports from desks before delegations visited, slipping pages into wastebaskets that were later burned in illicit stoves. A clerk, Marina, once rescued a torn-from-log casualty list and hid it under her apron, telling herself she would file it properly later. Later never came. Such small acts of concealment multiplied into institutional silence, telegrams annotated with euphemism, orders that delayed relief by hours, and public broadcasts that turned complex failure into simple resolve. Families receiving censored telegrams found the language curiously antiseptic. Missing in action became a phrase that occluded both fate and place. Meanwhile, in Politburo meetings, debates about propaganda utility overrode appeals from field commanders to be honest about losses. The state's narrative required a concentration of victories to sustain morale across an exhausted population. The cause was political necessity. The effect was a landscape of memory that would later be difficult to unpick. Field officers learned to craft reports with a keen eye for what would survive scrutiny and what would not. The front's true ledger, meanwhile, was recorded by men who kept private lists folded into their caps. What they didn't yet know was how this silence would be felt by the men who had given everything and returned to towns that only half remembered them. Veterans left the trenches and came to Moscow to find banquets and banners celebrating others' triumphs. They stood in crowds where speeches praised Stalingrad and wondered aloud why their winter had been overlooked. Some met bureaucrats who smiled and offered medals and small stipends, ceremonies that soothed but did not answer the hollow where comrades lay. A wounded sergeant named Leonid tried to claim recognition for his unit's effort, and found his file lost in transit, a casualty of administrative invisibility. The emotional effect was corrosive. Courage translated into nothing more than an unreturned ledger entry for many, while authentic grief was domesticated into state-sanctioned memory. Families whose sons had fallen at Rzhev waited at rail stations that never filled with returnees, and the rumor mill supplied half-truths that felt worse than silence. Local priests recorded names in parish books, and sometimes these small private acts were the only memorialization the fallen received for decades. The social contract frayed in places where public narrative and private loss diverged, creating a quiet dissonance that would shape post-war memory. The policy choices in Moscow created ripples that became permanent eddies in the record of the war. No one imagined this would become a moral hazard for leadership themselves, whose decisions were now being steered by image management rather than only by military calculus. In a late-night session, a senior aide suggested strategic pauses to consolidate resources, arguing that long-term victory required honesty and reallocation. Stalin's reply, terse and immovable, favored decisive impression over incremental correction. We must strike where the blow is felt most. The result was that theatres with immediate political resonance received disproportionate support, while others froze into neglect. Military necessity and political optics became entangled. Trains carrying supplies to one sector were rerouted to another because of radio headlines. Field commanders began to anticipate what would be reported about them, and reports sometimes adjusted conceptually to meet expected narratives rather than factual accuracy. The cause was a wartime calculus where morale and propaganda could not be ignored. The effect was a skewed distribution of sacrifice. In the cold glow of offices, men calculated the trade-offs with the precise logic of accountants, rather than the messy calculus of blood. Moscow's silence was thus not simple neglect, but a deliberate shaping of what the nation could bear to know. What they didn't yet know was how deeply such shaping would affect the historical memory of the campaign for decades. Archivists labeled boxes, and the selection of what went into public files versus what remained behind sealed doors began in this moment. Documents folded, photographs withheld, reports redacted. A scholar years later would face a landscape of absence and have to reconstruct events from fragments, oral testimonies, and the occasional smuggled ledger. In the present, the immediate consequence was simple: diminished relief, delayed reinforcements, and an operational tempo that prioritized propaganda as much as territorial gain. Rear commanders were instructed to prepare dispatches that celebrated successes, while lines that told of collapse were to be couched in language of tactical withdrawal or realignment. The men in the field read the newspapers and felt the distance between what was printed and what had happened, a gap that hardened into distrust. This divergence planted seeds of skepticism that would sprout in quiet conversations and in memorials erected in private yards. The political choices in Moscow rewrote the proximate past and shaped how future generations would wrestle with culpability and heroism. History, in that sense, was being edited in real time. In the corridors of power, younger aides sometimes asked if the concealment would survive the scrutiny of later years, and their elders responded with the weary logic of necessity. Victory must be kept in view, they said, as if long-term truth could be deferred for short-term survival. A minister reassured staff that wartime narratives often required compression. One victory could inspire millions, while many small sufferings might only demoralize. The practical effect was that resources flowed where headlines promised morale returns, and the human cost in other places was absorbed into silence. When a field commander appealed for transparency to secure more efficient support, his plea was described in minutes as impractical and filed accordingly. Individuals like the adjutant Yuri kept copies of letters and circuited them to friends, small acts of archival rebellion that would later matter. By evening the radio studio dimmed, and the last announcer rehearsed a line about the motherland's unbroken spirit before a microphone that waited like an altar. Lights in the Kremlin blinked out one by one, the city settling into a hush of intentional omission and official brightness. History turned its face to Stalingrad, leaving Rzhev to freeze unseen. They found him half buried against a shattered fence, his greatcoat buttoned to the chin, and a folded letter tucked into the pocket where his hand had frozen around it. Sergeant Pavel Ignatov's name was stitched into the lining, and the letter, smudged with soot and snow, began, "Mama, the road is hard, but I am well." A stretcher-bearer counted bodies as if doing inventory, his breath fogging in the still air, and then he closed Pavel's eyes and placed a twig across the chest to mark the spot until spring permitted proper rites. In hamlets and rail sidings, whispers arrived first as rumors and then as lists. Conscript numbers that would not be read aloud at dinner tables again. A mother at a station bench, Maria Petrova, kept staring down the track as if in the repetition of arrivals and departures, one last train might return her son. Instead, she received a terse telegram with the words missing in action, a phrase that could mean anything and everything. Field clerks recorded names in thin ledgers by candlelight, their pencils smearing when condensation pooled on the paper, while chaplains wrote prayers into margins that would later become part of small private liturgies. Graves were made where men fell when winter allowed, shallow pits with helmets set at one end like mute sentries. Often the markers were crude, an upended rifle, a carved initial in bark, and families would later travel miles to place a scarf or a rosary at the place that had no official coordinates in Moscow's reports. The physicality of loss was everywhere. Frozen fingers unclasped from laces, scabbards empty, boots filled with snow that never warmed again. Names were spoken in kitchen doorways, and in the quiet of night, they became the only form of continuity that could bridge the wartime rupture. For many, the war distilled into these small objects, letters, watches, a button, tokens that proved a man had existed before the final absence. What they didn't yet know was how many of those tokens would become the only testimony for decades, because official records were thin and the state's memory preferred other stories. In villages, fathers who had worked the same fields as their sons tried to match a photograph to a face, returned in rumor, placing a greasy thumb over cheek lines, and wishing, a railway worker, old Ivan, kept a watch he had found near a frozen slope. Its hands were stopped at the hour his neighbor had been reported killed, and he refused to hand it over when the mustered men asked for lists of recovered items. Letters were sometimes found in pockets. Months later, ink washed by melting snow into undecipherable strokes. When legible, they spoke of mundane things: bread, weather, a promise to return for the spring sowing, making the dead seem at once near and impossibly distant. The state censored dispatches, and the family's private mourning created a dissonance that felt like betrayal. The government lauded victories at a distance, while small farms kept candle vigils for sons who never walked back through their gates. In urban apartments, women read lists posted on station walls and compared numbers with knitted mittens and ration cards, marking names in cramped notebooks with a sorrow that grew into ritual. A volunteer at a field hospital, Tatiana, would later recall sewing identity tags onto uniforms, metal discs with stamped numbers, few of which found their way home. Each tag that did return was a bitter practical confirmation. Each tag that did not return became a question left in a nation's throat. The materiality of grief, cold metal, damp paper, softened photographs, kept history tangible when official narratives tried to smooth edges. No one imagined this would become a long shadow over lives that had already been rearranged by war. The absence of a son reshaped fields, finances, and futures. Widows counted on pensions that were stingy and slow, and many learned to stitch and to mend in new urgency, turning grief into labor. Children who waited for fathers at dusk learned to fold the empty spaces his tools had left into something like a memory, storing his comb in a tin, and listening for footsteps on creaking stairs that would not come. Communal rituals emerged once a month. A neighbor would bring bread to a grieving family, and people would gather at a roadside cross to say a short service for the missing. These acts of remembrance were practical, as much as pious, ensuring that someone would carry a name forward to the registers, and perhaps that later searches might find a grave. Field memorials grew out of ad hoc collections of relics, scrapbooks of letters, badges, and snapped bayonets, kept by mothers who could not bear the state's indifference. In the rear, veterans who returned with scars both visible and private visited these shrines, sometimes to find the names of those who had shared their foxhole, sometimes to place a cigarette or a small gadget on the makeshift altar. The communal memory formed in this way was ragged but persistent. It refused to be fully absorbed by official histories. The cause was absence, and the effect was a cultural fabric woven of small stubborn acts of keeping. What they didn't yet know was how the scale of unreturned men would complicate kinship and identity long after bullets stopped flying. Census records showed a gap in men of certain ages. Schools closed early to mark fallen alumni, and harvests had fewer hands to gather in the autumn. In towns, a banner might celebrate a division's heroism, while around it families quietly numbered the empty chairs at their tables. Some men who returned bore injuries that made them strangers to their own families, faces scarred, voices altered, and memories truncated. Those who made it back sometimes found themselves guilty in the strange calculus of survival, survivor's guilt that made smiles brittle and laughter rare. Others never returned in any form, and their status lingered as a bureaucratic limbo, legally alive, officially missing, and personally deceased to those who waited. The systems that could have reconciled these statuses were overwhelmed. A woman named Olga petitioned month after month for a death certificate to claim a small pension and found red tape more implacable than winter. Volunteers organized searches for graves in spring, when thaw revealed bones and artifacts, and those excavations sometimes matched a name to a place, offering a small delayed closure. The human consequence of one battle thus radiated outward: fewer hands for fields, fewer names to hand down, and a landscape of memory that would take generations to accept. No one imagined that the signs of absence would become a language of their own. Helmets, like snowed-over stones, a cluster of shovels leaning by an abandoned camp, a forgotten boot with laces knotted against further movement. Pilgrimages began in small ways. A father who had never left his village walked to a marked field and stood for hours in the sun until the cold stole him again. A sister scraped away snow to find the vague mound where her brother had died and pressed flowers, if any could be found, into the frozen earth. The physical effort of remembering mattered: rubbing clean a rusted spoon, repairing a torn photograph, keeping a watch wound until its mainspring failed. Men who had buried comrades in haste told the stories later, and those stories bore the intimacy of eyewitness testimony: who joked, who cursed most, who sang an old folk tune while shoveling. Such personal narratives often contradicted official dispatches, but they were more exact in human terms. They named small private acts of courage that paperwork erased. In kitchens and at kitchen tables, these recollections became the seeds of family lore, passed down to children who would one day ask where the great uncle had gone. The effect was a living memory that resisted official forgetting, an oral archive kept alive by meals, by names read aloud, and by the tactile objects that survived. What they didn't yet know was how these private acts of remembrance would eventually force public acknowledgement. Decades later, lists pieced together from field notes and parish records would reopen the question of where men lay. Archivists and amateur historians, following scraps of paper and the testimonies of aging women and men, would begin to stitch a fuller map of loss, locating unmarked graves and reconciling missing names. In the immediate aftermath, however, the work was intimate and local, families burying small boxes of keepsakes with the dead, and a village group raising a wooden cross where a family name might live on in the land. A woman named Irina later told a historian she had kept her brother's scarf for 40 years, wrapping it in oilcloth and passing it to her son as an heirloom of absence. These things, scarves, watches, letters, became tokens that anchored grief to place and time, and their existence would help reconstruct history when the state's files proved incomplete. The cause was loss. The effect over decades was memorialization that outlived propaganda. Memory moves slowly, and the men who never returned lived on in the small, durable acts of those who loved them. In the end, the tangible artifacts and the quiet rituals combined into a moral geography that refused erasure. Names carved into private crosses, a photograph in a locket, a train ticket pinned to a memory book. When children of the missing grew old, they carried these relics into towns and into meetings where they petitioned for records and recognition. Their patient work eventually pressed the public to remember. The state's narrative could celebrate grand victories, but it could not entirely suppress the accumulation of private griefs that multiplied into a public ache. Graves were marked, lists were compiled, names were read at small ceremonies, and the work of recollection continued in small groups that met at dusk to read aloud letters found in pockets. For many families, Rzhev remained not an event on a map, but a wound that reopened each winter when snow covered the fields. The fact that these acts of remembrance persisted, through scarcities, through censorship, through decades of quiet, proved the stubbornness of human memory. For many, Rzhev was not a place, it was where the world simply ended. They came upon the line beneath a low grey sky, and the first sound was the soft hiss of wind across untouched snow, as if the world were trying to breathe quietly. Trenches that had once echoed with shouted orders, and the clatter of tools now held only the delicate architecture of frost. Wooden revetments bowed under a glassy crust, and rusted bayonets poked like dead branches. A burned-out T-34 lay half-buried with its turret, yawed to the sky, the engine block cracked, and the 76.2 mm barrel pointing as if accusing the clouds. Mechanics long gone had left a mess of grease and a torn canvas that fluttered like a fatigued flag. Ravens circled above and dropped to the ground to peck at hides and scraps, indifferent scavengers marking the end of an argument between men. A squad of reconnaissance men moved slowly, their boots whispering rather than crunching, cataloguing positions with the detached precision of archivists. GPS had not yet been taught to them, only pace counts and compass bearings. Field maps were annotated and folded away into oilcloth, corners stiff with condensation and soot, and every mark told a story of an attempt and a loss. In a shell crater, a frozen canteen still clung to a splintered strap. A sergeant stooped and turned it over, feeling the weight of absence like a small stone. The silence was not empty. It was a storehouse of echoes, spent cartridges, collapsed dugouts, and the faint geometry of boot prints under new snow. Men who walked the lines did so with a reverence that felt almost sacred, their steps slowing as if to avoid waking the past. The guns had stopped, but the landscape retained the grammar of battle. What they didn't yet know was how thoroughly those traces would outlast official memory, and how quickly bureaucracy would try to tidy the story into something less complicated. In the rear, a logistics officer named Kermerov filled forms noting "Operation Suspended," and the phrase carried an administrative finality that blurred the nuance of months of fighting into a single line. Orders circulated to clear forward positions for inspection teams, to remove abandoned material that could be salvaged, and to catalogue what remained. Salvage crews came with ropes and pulleys to strip metal from frozen hulls and to stockpile usable parts. Soviet field historians, real men with notebooks, walked the lines and wrote down coordinates, but many of their notes would be classified or filed away for years. In German units, officers performed similar inventories, their Wehrmacht logs recording captured equipment and positions held with an efficiency born of habit. Their reports would later feed into narratives of stubborn defense. Civilians who returned to fields found the odd remnants of war, children's toys cracked by frost, a spoon with initials scratched into its handle, small proofs of lives interrupted. Men who had survived the carnage lingered at gravesites when weather allowed, carving crude crosses and placing simple stones. Their hands moved with ritual calm, gathering what dignity the earth permitted. In towns, market talk shifted from immediate survival to accounting, who had returned, who had not, and which fields would lie fallow because hands were gone. The effect of this quiet work was to turn battlefields into archives, and to make memory a labor as practical as any engineering task: record, mark, and preserve. The silence then was not simply absence but the labor of remembrance beginning in the open air. No one imagined this would become a season in which nature itself would act as both preserver and eraser. Frost crept into canvas and wood and, over months, consumed the sharp edges of tracks and footprints until only hollows remained. In spring, the thaw would reveal new evidence and new sorrow. Field graves, hastily dug where ground permitted, were covered with branches and snow. Anonymous markers half swallowed by winter's appetite. Later excavations would sometimes recover a watch, a boot, or a scrap of uniform that allowed a name to be matched to a place. In some sectors, burned engines and track links were scavenged by locals who saw metal as both resource and relic. Their carts creaked with salvaged parts that would be turned into plows or stoves. The war's detritus reborn as tools of subsistence. Commanders on both sides issued orders to fence off certain zones as dangerous, mined ground and unexploded ordnance, turning fields into hazards that rural populations would not discover until thaw. Engineers left behind maps of minefields in crude ink, but maps fade and paper rots. The knowledge of danger passed by word of mouth in villages where elders remembered which groves to avoid. A field worker named Anna would later recall finding the skeleton of a horse entangled in wire. She wrapped the bones in an old sheet and buried them by a barn, a private rite that resisted official neatness. The landscape thus became palimpsest, layers of human action, nature's reclamation, and local remembrance overwritten but never wholly erased. The physical details mattered: trodden berms, rust-streaked metal, the angle of collapse in a dugout, all of which testified to the particular cruelty of winter warfare. The frozen silence was therefore not benign. It was evidence that time would not fully soften the imprint of violence. What they didn't yet know was how the quiet would shape conversations long after guns ceased, who counted as a victor, who as a sufferer, and which stories would be told in public. In cryptic memos, officials debated whether to promote monuments to commemorate sacrifice or to emphasize other theaters where propaganda would yield clearer political advantage. Memory became a matter of policy as much as piety. A junior archivist, Dmitri, copied field sketches into a ledger that he tucked away from his superiors, fearing their selective edits. Such clandestine acts would later provide historians with fragments to reconstruct the truth. Meanwhile, farmers refurbished fences and re-sowed fields, their plows turning over metal fragments that triggered old shrapnel and near disasters, reminding everyone that the war's debris was physical and persistent. Children who grew up in the years after the battle would hear adult stories that varied by household. Some spoke of heroism, others of waste, and a few named the specific young men whose photographs hung in mildew-streaked rooms. Oral memory and official text began to diverge in subtle ways, a cultural fissure that sometimes hardened into resentment when families compared state honors with personal loss. The effect of silence in the capital fed local narratives of neglect. Townspeople noted when trains stopped bringing wood or bread, and connected the decrease to the distant administrative choices that had reshaped supply lines. The landscape thus became a teacher, and its lessons were gritty, that the past remains materially present in rust and ruts, and that silence can be a political instrument as much as a condition. No one imagined this muted aftermath would test the endurance of both memory and metal. Thaw would bring its own revelations and perils. When spring arrived, the snow retreated and revealed rows of shallow graves and the corroded carcasses of tanks, the metal now more fragile than men had been when they burned. Exhumations began in some places, led by relatives and volunteers who sought to bring names home, and the work was slow, precise, and heartbreaking. Bones were wrapped, artifacts catalogued, and names matched where possible. In other zones, the thaw reactivated old minefields, and bitter accidents claimed peasants and children who stumbled across buried devices, turning memory into fresh mourning. Local governments published lists pieced together from parish registers, field reports, and oral accounts, and those lists were imperfect, causing disputes that lasted years. In a small municipal office, a clerk named Galina compiled names from scavenged artifacts and letters, and her ledger would become a reference for later memorials. Her patience was a civic labor as crucial as any battlefield task. Veterans returned to the fields to find helmets and dog tags, and to place small stones on improvised graves, acts of mourning that were simultaneously intimate and civic. The thaw revealed both the brutality of what had occurred and the persistence of what was left behind, making remembrance a public act of retrieval, rather than mere private solace. The frozen silence had been a pause. Thaw turned it into testimony. What they didn't yet know was how the echoes of this pause would travel across generations, and how the very idea of remembrance would be contested. In years to come, some politicians would prefer broad narratives of triumph, while families insisted on lists of names, and historians argued over the balance between operational success and human cost. Memorials would be proposed, debated, and sometimes built, their inscriptions negotiating between collective pride and personal tragedy. The decision of which names to include became a moral and political question. Children of the missing became activists for recognition, petitioning archives and officials, and their persistence slowly broadened the public record, private grief forcing public account. Local museums collected artifacts, a scorched helmet here, a field journal there, each item a shard that refused to let memory harden into a single script. Over time, the frozen silence made room for a layered memory, official monuments that lauded sacrifice, parish records that named the missing, and family shrines that kept private vigil. The multiplicity of these memorials was itself a testament to the complexity of war. No single narrative could bear the whole truth. The guns stopped, but the snow remembered where they stood. They locked the archive door, and the clerk slid the file across the table as if passing contraband. The paper edges crisp like winter crust, and the ink still smelling faintly of smoke and oil. In the reading room, a historian, thin and watchful, unrolled a map stained with shell splatter and circled names that no longer featured in official summaries. A red pencil registered the coordinates of unit losses, while an assistant in the corner folded a photograph of a ruined trench and tucked it under a ledger marked for delayed release. Outside, the city kept its own momentum. Broadcasts praised triumphs at Stalingrad, and in the Ministry of Information, a young editor crossed out a paragraph that mentioned costly northern setbacks. Paperwork became a battleground for memory, what stayed visible and what was hidden under stamps and sealed envelopes. Archivists learned a new craft, not of preservation, but of selective preservation. Some boxes were marked with bright tabs, others with a careful silence. In a basement storeroom, a crate was labeled operational, confidential, and the wooden lid closed with a sound like a verdict. The men and women who handled these things moved with the sober concentration of people who comprehend that documents can reconstruct lives and in a different hand erase them. Bureaucracy, in that moment, wielded the authority of history. What they didn't yet know was how effective that authority could be when combined with necessity and narrative appetite. In regional party offices, photographs were peeled from bulletin boards with gloved hands and quietly replaced with images of flag-raising and triumphant columns. A portrait of exhausted soldiers was replaced by a staged tableau of smiling veterans. A local commissar, named Anton, argued that such substitutions were essential to sustain morale and to maintain faith in a costly war. It was persuasive rhetoric in warm rooms where ration lists and morale reports justified tidy public messaging. The effect filtered outward. Memorial services emphasized glory and omitted operational failure, and school lessons reframed the winter months as a prologue to decisive victory, rather than a complex sequence of setback and sacrifice. Junior historians who questioned these edits were encouraged to focus on grand strategy. Their mentors warned of the dangers of demoralization and of the political cost of too much truth. The cause was practical, political stability in wartime, and the effect was an institutional habit of omission that would ossify into official memory. In the quiet of archives, the lost details accumulated like dust. No one imagined this would become a curated silence that lasted decades, not just months. In Moscow, an official directive circulated advising that the narrative balance favor heroes and minimize costly failures. It used the language of duty and higher purpose, and those who received it obeyed without public complaint. Records were stamped for official use only, and historians found access to primary reports restricted behind layers of approval. A junior archivist named Elena risked whispering to a colleague about a boxed dispatch that detailed casualty numbers inconsistent with public claims. Her cautionary notes were transcribed and then lost in a file folder marked Archival Purge. Over time, the public memory assembled from what was allowed to be seen: heroic arcs, pivotal victories, narratives with clear moral lines. The consequence was that Operation Mars receded from the public story of the war, not because it was small, but because the machinery of memory decided it inconvenient. Families searching for confirmation of a son's fate encountered silences where they needed answers. The institutional choice to tidy the past produced an absence that would later stump scholars and wound relatives. What they didn't yet know was that omission breeds curiosity, and that the very act of concealment would leave traces for those who cared to look. In a provincial library, a librarian found a marginal note in an old periodical that hinted at unit movements inconsistent with official accounts, and she slipped the torn page into an envelope for safekeeping. Veterans whispered in taverns about nights that official histories omitted, and passed around cigarette-creased maps that traced different lines of advance. These counter-memories became a subterranean archive: oral testimony, smuggled letters, photographs tucked into family albums, and the persistent memory of those who had been there. Over time, such fragments would be the scaffolding for later historical recovery. But in the immediate post-war years, they were fragile and easily swept aside. The institutional consequences were practical. National archives were neat and persuasive, local memory ragged and insistent. The tension between them formed the shape of later debates about culpability, heroism, and the costs of victory. For now, the operation's absence from the official ledger felt like a small betrayal to those who had paid dearly. No one imagined how personal grief would collide with state amnesia and create long-lived resentments. Mothers who had pinned photographs to their walls found the faces absent from museum exhibits that celebrated other campaigns. They kept vigil regardless, a quiet counterpoint to the resounding public ceremonies. A widower named Boris would later describe the feeling as a second wound. First the death of his son, then the erasure of his son's memory from the nation's story. Private memorials cropped up in backyard plots and in churchyards, stubborn and unregulated, where names were carved on wood and candles burned in winter winds. These small rituals preserved truths official histories omitted, and they became sites of local memory that anchored communal identity. The effect was cumulative as generations passed. These local commemorations became the repositories of authenticity, pressing against the smoother public narratives. The moral geography of the war thus developed dual tracks: the sanctioned narrative that fed national pride, and the lived memory that bore witness to loss. In kitchens and at kitchen tables, people kept the stories alive with the stubbornness of those who know loss intimately. What they didn't yet know was how later historians would unpick these tensions, and how little evidence would sometimes be enough to reopen a conversation. Decades after the war, a scrap of a field diary, a photograph with the wrong caption, or a smuggled telegram could ignite renewed inquiry. Institutional silence proved porous to persistent research. Archivists who had once filed away inconvenient truths found their notebooks subpoenaed by younger scholars with patient methods and long memories. The process was slow and often contested, but memory's elasticity allowed the buried to return in altered form. Publications emerged that balanced political expedience against human cost, and the public conversation widened to include previously excised chapters. For families, these recoveries were sometimes partial, sometimes bitter, but they validated long-held suspicions and offered a measure of public acknowledgement. The practical consequence was that history became less tidy but more honest, and the cost of earlier erasure was laid bare. Historians compiled footnotes where once there had been blanks, and the record grew thicker and more human. In the end, the story of disappearance was not merely institutional but moral. Choices made under pressure shape which memories would be honored and which would be buried. Men in offices folded banners and stored them in trunks. Photographs were placed in envelopes and slid into desk drawers with the finality of a ritual burial. The victors wrote of triumph and buried their failures beneath frost, not always out of malice, but often from a wartime calculus that prized narrative coherence over messy truth. The consequence was a palimpsest of memory, an official line that moved the nation forward, and a trailing set of private stubborn traces that insisted on being true. The two together formed a fuller account of a war that had never been simple. In that tension between tidy victory and the ragged reality of the front, history kept working at its own slow pace, sifting, testing, and finally, sometimes, restoring what had been hidden. The victors wrote of triumph and buried their failures beneath frost. Snow fell again over the Rzhev fields, though no one marked the date anymore. It came quietly, coating the rusted armor left where men had fallen, turning every wreck into the same pale monument. A farmer named Nikolai, who had survived the fighting, paused with his plow when the blade struck metal. He brushed away the frost and recognized the curve of a Soviet helmet half buried in the soil. He didn't speak. He simply covered it again with snow, as if tucking a body back into rest. By then, the newspapers carried names of victories far south and west: Kursk, Dnieper, Berlin, and no one asked after the marshes near Rzhev. Trains moved through the region again, their whistles long and hollow, carrying timber and coal instead of soldiers. The silence around the place felt intentional, like an agreement between survivors to let the earth keep its secrets. In the villages, people repaired roofs, married, raised children, and learned not to mention what they had seen. History, for the moment, preferred cleaner lines. What they didn't yet know was that this silence would last longer than the scars in the land itself. In 1944, committees drafted plans for memorials to major victories, and the allocations of marble, bronze, and labor followed accordingly. There were statues to Stalingrad, murals to Kursk, and solemn wreaths laid for Leningrad, all righteous and deserved, but none for the nameless trenches by the Volga's upper bend. Official memory required symbols, and Rzhev offered none that could fit neatly into triumphal narrative. No liberated city, no dramatic reversal, only attrition. Veterans who had fought there carried their medals for other operations and left their Rzhev service unspoken, their memories compressed into small silences at reunions. At veterans' parades, when men compared campaigns, the mention of Rzhev drew nods but no elaboration. Some called it superstition, others shame. The war moved on in story, if not in soil, and the country followed. No one imagined that these men would live into old age with memories they could not quite share. In communal apartments, they drank tea in silence and avoided the word itself. Rzhev, as if uttering it might bring the smell of burned flesh back into the room. Their grandchildren asked about the war, and the stories came out sideways, folded into tales of camaraderie, or deflected with humor. The hardest details were translated into silence. Men who had fought elsewhere told stories freely: the tank duels at Kursk, the river crossings near the Dnieper, while Rzhev veterans stared at their cups. In official veteran bulletins, editors revised testimonies that dwelled too long on that front, describing it instead as the northern sector. The archives remained closed, the numbers absent from textbooks. And so the public imagination moved on, filling its monuments with triumph, leaving behind an unmarked wound under the snow. What they didn't yet know was how deeply this avoidance would shape the psychology of a generation. Silence became the default language of remembrance. Families carried portraits of the fallen at parades, but few of those portraits came from Rzhev. Those who might have carried them did not know where to begin the story. The local people who still lived near the old lines learned to avoid questions from visiting journalists. It was simpler to gesture to the newer fields and say, "There was nothing here." Bureaucrats filled forms for reconstruction and agricultural quotas, lines of ink passing over land that had been graves. The moral geography of post-war life demanded productivity, not reflection. The veterans who still plowed these fields built barns and schools on ground where bones lay shallow, and in the act of building found temporary peace. In Moscow, the word Mars belonged to a planet again, not an operation. No one imagined that this forgetting could feel like mercy, or that mercy could feel like betrayal. For some, the act of not remembering spared them the weight of ghosts. For others, it felt like losing their comrades twice. There were gatherings in quiet courtyards where men toasted to those who stayed behind, and then let the conversation drift. They didn't need to name the place. Everyone in that circle knew. The jokes that followed were half-hearted, as if spoken to test whether laughter was still permitted. Among them was Major Sokolov, who kept a folded map of the Rzhev Salient in his drawer, but never took it out except on New Year's Eve, when he lit a candle and placed it beside his medals. He didn't call it grief, he called it tidying the soul. For him, forgetting wasn't denial, it was endurance. What they didn't yet know was that the landscape itself would remember better than men. Spring thaws each year brought up fragments, dog tags, ration tins, bone. Farmers stacked them by the road until trucks came to haul the debris away, but sometimes the trucks never came. Over time, locals began collecting the objects into sheds and barns, small museums of private conscience, shelves of helmets, a wall of buttons. a glass jar of spent rounds. These improvised memorials had no plaques, only the smell of dust and oil. Children would play near them, their games sometimes interrupted by the discovery of another relic, another story unearthed. The land was not done speaking, even if the people were. No one imagined that such small acts of care would become the only record left for decades. Official memory hardened around grander battles. Teachers lectured on turning points, on offensives, on the heroic logic of victory. But history written in broad strokes cannot feel the texture of frostbite or the rhythm of the pickaxe carving frozen soil. Veterans understood this, and when they met, they recognized one another not by medals but by silences. The way someone paused before answering or looked down when the name Rzhev appeared in print. To them, that pause was recognition enough. The world they had survived was too heavy to carry into conversation. For the country, progress required forgetting. For them, peace required the same. It began in a dim archive room where a single bulb buzzed against the silence, throwing a circle of light onto dust-covered files that had not been opened in 50 years. Historian Sergei Antonov, grey-haired and thin from long winters of research, slid one binder from the shelf and brushed away the crust of disuse. The folder's edges crackled like frost. Inside were operational reports dated November 1942, Operation Mars. Stamped across the top in faded ink was secret. Not for publication. Antonov adjusted his glasses, reading casualty figures that no one had seen since the war, numbers that contradicted the official story. His pen hovered, uncertain whether to underline or simply breathe. For decades, Soviet archives had guarded their silences like fortresses. Now in the new Russia, the locks were giving way to keys both literal and moral. Papers once deemed politically sensitive were being catalogued anew, their edges curling under fluorescent light. He turned a page and found handwritten notes in pencil, losses unsustainable, reinforcements delayed. That single phrase felt like an exhalation from the past, a voice surfacing through permafrost. In that quiet moment, history began to thaw. What they didn't yet know was that this rediscovery would ripple far beyond the scholars' rooms. Across the former front lines, small excavation teams had begun to dig. Not treasure hunters, but volunteers with spades and reverence. They worked where the forests met the fields, guided by metal detectors and the whispered advice of old maps. Each find was treated with ceremony: a spoon, a buckle, a rusted rifle, sometimes bones tangled with webbing that once held a man upright. Snow fell quietly around them, muffling the scrape of shovels, and breath steamed like incense in the cold. When remains were found, men knelt. They spoke softly, using words as careful as tools. Every discovery was both intimate and immense, proof that the earth had never truly kept its secrets, only delayed their telling. The air around those dig sites felt weighted, charged with history pressing back into the present. The work was archaeology of conscience. No one imagined that the truth would come not from governments, but from the convergence of curiosity, mourning, and persistence. Veterans who had long refused interviews began to talk. Their reserve eroded not by persuasion, but by time. Old men gathered in kitchens, spreading out maps like relics, their fingers tracing lines they had once bled along. Mikhail Petrovich, once a platoon sergeant, tapped the edge of a river drawn in blue pencil and said quietly, "Here, it was here we vanished." His granddaughter recorded every word. Across the country, journalists wrote articles titled "The Forgotten Battle of Rzhev" and Zhukov's Lost Offensive. Debate followed, not just about tactics, but about truth itself. Who owned it? Who hid it? Who bore it? For the first time, The operation that had once been a footnote now had names, faces, and numbers. Memory, long suppressed, was finding its own language again. What they didn't yet know was how divisive revelation could be. For some, this rediscovery was liberation, an honest reckoning at last. For others, it was disloyalty, a reopening of wounds that had been sealed by sacrifice. Debates in newspapers turned heated, as older veterans defended Zhukov's reputation, while younger historians demanded accountability. On television, grainy footage of the Rzhev Salient appeared beside talking heads who spoke of strategic necessity and avoidable tragedy. At memorial gatherings, old soldiers stood silently as others argued around them. They had seen too much to find purity in blame. The truth was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. Bravery and error intertwined, heroism and futility inseparable. The rediscovery of Operation Mars revealed not just a hidden campaign, but the architecture of forgetting itself. Every revelation carried both pride and pain, as if the country were remembering a wound and realizing it still hurt. No one imagined that the work of excavation would become pilgrimage. Each summer, search parties, called poiskoviki, arrived at Rzhev with shovels, stretchers, and Orthodox priests. They moved through the forest with patience, guided by old coordinates and intuition, and when they uncovered remains, they placed them gently in zinc coffins. Sometimes identification tags survived, corroded but legible, sometimes only buttons or teeth told the story. The recovered were buried again with ceremony, flags folded, prayers spoken, and silence kept. Families came from faraway towns, bringing framed photographs of men who had vanished before they were born. It was a new kind of history-making, rooted not in archives, but in the soil itself. The landscape, once mute, began to speak again, through artifacts, through testimony, through ritual. In this act of remembrance, truth and reverence became the same motion. What they didn't yet know was how the act of remembering would bind generations separated by ideology. Young volunteers born after the Soviet collapse listened to veterans who had once been silenced. A girl named Katya recorded oral histories for a local museum. She said, "It feels like we are listening to ghosts, but they are grateful we finally came." Her recordings captured tremors in old men's voices, not fear, but recognition. A historian compiled those testimonies into a digital archive, giving faces and words to what had once been statistics. Across Russia, exhibitions displayed letters, uniforms, fragments of maps, each labeled with care and humility. Where once there had been omission, now there was inquiry. Where there had been silence, now there was sound. It was not triumphal, but it was truthful. No one imagined how emotionally costly truth could be, even decades later. Veterans broke down while describing comrades who never returned. Some admitted things they had hidden all their lives. Orders misunderstood, attacks gone wrong, moments of doubt. These confessions carried no shame, only exhaustion, the relief of finally placing something heavy on the ground. For historians, the challenge was not just to record facts, but to hold space for grief. Excavation reports were written like eulogies. Footnotes became elegies. The rediscovery of Operation Mars was less about correcting history than about restoring dignity. A nation that had won the war was now learning to acknowledge how much of itself it had lost along the way. In the end, the truth did not arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, in the rustle of papers, the scrape of spades, the tremor of old voices recounting what the snow had once hidden. Across the forests of Rzhev, the wind carried the sound of tools and prayers in equal measure. For the first time in half a century, the silence began to lift, and what lay beneath was not accusation, but acknowledgement. History was not rewritten. It was unburied. Truth thawed slowly, like a body buried deep beneath winter. The reel flickered to life, casting silver light across the archive wall. Marshal Georgy Zhukov saluting from a reviewing stand, medals gleaming, his eyes steady beneath the visor's brim. The film, brittle with age, made his movements mechanical, yet the crowd below seemed alive, their cheers an oceanic roar preserved in celluloid. Beside the screen, historian Natalia Sidorova scribbled notes in the half-dark, her pen catching pauses more than words. She watched how the man looked past the lens, as if seeing something only he could measure, a victory that had cost too much to name. Then, with a click, the film stopped. The image froze mid-salute, the hand suspended between command and confession. Around her, the faint hum of the projector seemed to fill the silence that followed. On the table lay open documents from the Rzhev operation, casualty figures, memoranda, and Stalin's terse approvals scrawled in red pencil. The juxtaposition was disquieting, parades above, ruins below. Truth, she realized, was not the enemy of greatness, only its mirror. What they didn't yet know was that this re-evaluation would redefine not just Zhukov, but the myth of the Soviet war itself. In the 1990s, as archives opened and memoirs once censored found print, scholars began to question the legend that had gilded him into marble. Some called him a genius of attrition, ruthless, efficient, inevitable. Others saw him as the embodiment of Soviet pragmatism, whose victories were paid for with oceans of blood. Each argument drew from the same sources: orders written under duress, telegrams from Stalin's desk, field reports scrawled by exhausted adjutants at 3 in the morning. Zhukov's defenders noted the pressures he faced: a dictator's impatience, a nation's desperation, a front that stretched the imagination. His critics pointed to Mars as evidence of hubris, of blind momentum mistaken for strength. The truth lay somewhere between, a man operating within a system that punished hesitation more than failure. Even in criticism, the air around his name carried reverence, as though history itself hesitated to raise its voice. No one imagined this new debate would echo so personally among those who had served under him. Veterans, now old and stooped, wrote letters to newspapers, some defending, some condemning, all searching for closure. "He was hard, but he saved us," wrote one colonel. "He sent us to die without reason," wrote another. The arguments never reached consensus, only an accumulation of testimony that sounded like confession. In memorial halls, visitors stood before his portrait, uncertain whether to salute or to bow their heads. His marble likeness in Red Square seemed to absorb both gratitude and resentment, its eyes cast perpetually toward a horizon that no longer required orders. Soldiers who had once cursed him in the mud of Rzhev now lit candles beneath his photograph. It was not forgiveness they sought, only understanding. Time, they knew, had turned him into both hero and scapegoat, and neither role felt entirely fair. What they didn't yet know was that historians abroad were asking similar questions from another vantage. Western analysts, newly granted access to Soviet archives, compared the timing of Mars with Operation Uranus at Stalingrad. They saw a diversionary logic, one front bleeding to draw German reserves away from another. To them, Mars was not failure, but deliberate sacrifice, calculated and grim. Russian historians recoiled at the suggestion. To call the operation a feint was to diminish the men who died believing in its purpose. The debate widened from tactics to ethics, from military theory to the morality of command. If one victory required another's suffering, where did genius end and cruelty begin? No scholar could say for certain, and perhaps that uncertainty was its own verdict. Zhukov, who had once ruled with clarity, now existed in ambiguity, the most human sentence history can impose. No one imagined that this quiet reckoning would extend into personal memory, reshaping even the relics that bore his name. In museums, medals once gleamed proudly beneath glass. Now visitors paused longer before them, tracing the engraved years 1942, 1943, 1943, 1945, triumphs threaded with omission. A curator at the Central Armed Forces Museum adjusted the lighting on his display case, so the reflection of nearby photographs of Rzhev's dead fell faintly across his portrait. Outside, snow drifted down over Moscow, covering bronze statues and forgotten plaques alike. In that snowfall, it was hard to tell what was erasure and what was grace. A young guide told a group of students, "He built victory," and paused before adding, "But victory built him too, from loss." The room fell silent, and somewhere deep within the archives, old paper breathed in the dryness of winter air. What they didn't yet know was how history would continue to oscillate between condemnation and awe. Each generation redrew the man according to its own needs, a titan for some, a tyrant for others, a mirror for all. His face on textbooks shifted subtly. The hero's jawline softened, the tone of captions less absolute. Yet the essence remained, a commander who embodied the paradox of total war, where necessity and morality collided in every order given. Scholars produced monographs, veterans produced memoirs, and filmmakers produced reenactments that cast him alternately in light and shadow. In one documentary, an actor playing Zhukov whispered, "There is no victory without guilt," and the line lingered long after the credits rolled. The audience understood, perhaps more than they wished to. Greatness too leaves shadows, and some stretch farther than the man who cast them. The camera opens on the slow movement of wind through a meadow, long grass bending where trenches once scored the soil. Wild flowers bloom through rusted helmets, their stems curling around the fractured steel, like threads of forgiveness weaving through a wound. Somewhere nearby, a child's laughter echoes faintly. School groups visit now, walking among the memorial paths in bright jackets, unaware of how close their feet come to the bones of soldiers. An elderly man named Victor stands by a low granite slab etched with names, his gloved hand tracing one he cannot read clearly anymore. Behind him, the Rzhev Memorial to the Soviet soldier rises into the sky, a bronze figure dissolving into a flight of cranes. The sculpted cloak seems to ripple with the real wind, and in that motion there is grace, not triumph. Visitors speak in whispers as if the very air expects reverence. Beneath their steps, the ground still bears the faint contour of old trenches, geometry of suffering softened by decades of rain. Insects hum. The war has gone silent here, but silence itself has become its language. What they didn't yet know, those who first proposed this memorial, was how powerfully the land would reclaim what men once tried to dominate. In spring, the pine forests bleed sap that smells of resin and smoke, and the streams still uncover fragments, buttons, belt buckles, sometimes a tooth. Volunteers come every season, digging with small spades and infinite patience, the poiskoviki, who call themselves the searchers. They uncover remains wrapped in the earth's slow embrace, treating each discovery like a returned prayer. Every find is tagged, catalogued, and reburied with ceremony. Orthodox priests bless the ground while children hold red carnations, their eyes wide with a quiet, inherited wonder. The act is not archaeology, it is a kind of dialogue between generations. The soil gives, and the living answer. Around the excavations, the wind carries both bird song and the faint echo of artillery. Imagined or remembered, no one is sure which. In Rzhev, memory is a weather pattern, recurring, ungovernable, and tender. No one imagined that peace would settle here, not as stillness, but as rhythm. Farmers till the same fields their grandfathers fought upon, ploughing through layers of history that refuse to vanish. Now and then the metal teeth of machinery ring against buried iron, a shell casing, a helmet, a twisted rifle. The tractor stops, the driver dismounts, lifts the relic, and places it beside a marker. It is ritual without instruction, repeated thousands of times. The forest nearby has grown dense again, swallowing the outlines of bunkers and gun pits. Moss coats the concrete, and saplings grow from the mouths of forgotten firing slits. The landscape, in its quiet persistence, has become both tomb and testament. The air smells of pine, not cordite, but on foggy mornings, locals swear the forest hums, not haunted, only remembering. The peace here has weight. What they didn't yet know was that remembrance, once a state ritual, would return to something smaller, more human, in nearby villages. Every May, families light candles on windowsills, their glow reflected in glass like distant flares. They read aloud the names of men who never returned, though many of those names have long since faded from the lists. Young soldiers stationed at nearby bases come to stand watch at the memorial, their breath steaming in the cold dawn. They are quiet, not out of command, but instinct. School teachers guide students through local museums filled with artifacts, each tagged with Care Canteen, found 2012, uniform button, found 2018, unknown soldier. The children's questions are simple. Did he win? Was he scared? And no one tries too hard to answer. The story now belongs to reflection, not certainty. The past breathes here, but it no longer demands allegiance, only listening. No one imagined how much this quiet devotion would reshape the moral landscape of modern Russia. Historians who once argued over tactics now focus on names, lists recovered from archives, diaries pieced together letter by letter. Their offices are modest, lined with filing cabinets and old photographs, yet their work carries gravity beyond any statue. They correspond with families, matching fragments to records, reuniting stories long separated by censorship and time. Some of them visit the fields at dawn, taking soil samples and photographs, treating history as something that still metabolizes in the present. Journalists interview survivors in nursing homes, where the past lives in worn hands and half-remembered songs. It's good, one veteran says, that they finally came back for us. And outside his window, snow begins to fall, light, forgiving, and eternal. The weight of forgetting has at last begun to lift. No one imagined that remembrance could be beautiful without being triumphant. The Rzhev Memorial Complex is surrounded by wild grass and flowers, left deliberately untrimmed so nature might do the final work of absolution. The monument's reflection in the pond below shivers whenever wind touches the water, as if the statue itself were breathing. On cold mornings, mist drifts from the forest into the valley, curling around crosses and candle lanterns left by visitors. At dusk, the bronze soldier seems to disappear into the twilight, merging with the cranes above him. It is not victory he embodies now, but release, the surrender of pain into permanence. Pilgrims come from across Russia, some laying flowers, others simply standing in silence, feeling the enormity of what lies beneath. Peace here is not the absence of war. It is its transformation into memory. The field endures, and so does the listening. What they didn't yet know was that the legacy of Rzhev would become less about death than about the endurance of compassion. The men who once fell here no longer belong to nations, but to time itself, shared, mourned, and understood. Historians, soldiers, and children walk the same paths, breathing the same cold air, that once carried gunpowder. On anniversaries, the bells of nearby churches toll in a pattern that mimics distant artillery, not as warning, but as acknowledgement. The cycle of memory continues. Discovery, mourning, gratitude, silence. The past has ceased to accuse. It only reminds across the meadows, wildflowers sway where helmets rust, and the light moves gently over them like a benediction. They bent their heads against the dusk, as if the wind itself had weight. And in that small motion, the field became a congregation. A lone figure, an older veteran named Sergei Petrov, walked a worn path between low stone markers, his fingers trailing over names half eroded by weather and time. The light was a thin coin of amber sinking behind birches. Branches traced slow, patient gestures above trenches now soft with moss. A distant river glinted like a seam of mercury, its surface stitched with the slow breath of ice, and the thin star that would guide no sailor. Children's voices from a nearby village fell off as if ashamed of their brightness, and the old men listened with a kind of careful gratitude. Sergei carried a small tin with a single candle, and when he placed it by a helmet, the flame flared and then folded politely into shadow. Around him, the earth remembered not in rhetoric, but in small objects: a bent spoon, a button stamped with a factory mark, a fragment of a map folded and refolded until its creases became part of the texture of mourning. Each relic, uncovered and catalogued, translated human movement into physical evidence that the land retained. The dusk deepened into a quiet that honored these objects by not speaking, allowing memory to be a plain, practical light. In that hush, the past did not weep. It simply arranged itself into the geometry of remembrance. What they didn't yet know was how many such small acts of tending would turn private grief into public duty over decades to come. Volunteers, mostly young people, named in passing, like Katia and Mikhail, came with gloves and gloves again, learning how to lift a bone from soil without breaking it, and how to wrap a name in zinc as if sewing a pocket of truth. Their work began with maps and metal detectors and ended with tea in a shed where old veterans told stories in low voices and the young took notes, not to publish, but to honor. A local historian, Dr. Elena Morozova, catalogued each find and cross-referenced it with brittle ledgers until she could say, with a scholar's modesty, which unit likely buried what and when. The cause was simple, people still wanted to know, and the effect was cumulative: a public memory rebuilt from shards, a museum exhibit that displayed a rusted helmet beside a boy's drawing of a sun. Schools began to schedule visits. Children learned to place flowers and then to stand quietly, which is perhaps the hardest lesson after triumph. The legal bureaucracy that once obscured names could not stop soil from remembering whose boots had pressed it. Small ceremonies multiplied into anniversaries, and anniversaries became part of a civic calendar. The land, patient as always, accommodated these rituals without complaint. No one imagined this would become a language of reconciliation as much as recovery. On certain grey mornings, German and Russian delegations would meet under a shared banner at a field marker, exchange photographs, and recite names aloud in both languages, simple acts that unpeeled decades of estrangement. An archivist from Berlin, Klaus Müller, and a Russian researcher, Anna Belova, would stand side by side reading out rosters, their pronunciations imperfect but their purpose identical: to make absent men present again. The exchange changed the tone from accusation to accounting. Where once each side had counted losses to validate its narrative, they now counted bodies to honor persons. Households that once maintained silence opened cupboards and sent letters scrawled in hands that had held rifles and then plows, donating relics that closed loops across borders. The cause was truth revealed in soil and paper, The effect was human connection that outlasted ideology. Veterans who had spent decades avoiding photographs now leaned forward to show grandchildren the faces of comrades. The shame of silence softened into the pride of faithful remembrance. The field's new language was modest. Names, dates, objects, gestures, simple, factual, human. Memory reshaped itself into something communal and ongoing. What they didn't yet know was how fragile this recovered memory could be in the face of politics and convenience. There were debates in municipal halls about where to place monuments, arguments over phrasing on plaques, and occasional attempts to compress complex loss into triumphant slogans. A local official suggested a grander memorial that would draw tourists and funds, while elder veterans objected, asking only for a quiet place with benches and an honest list of names. The cause was practical, resources and visibility, and the effect was contested aesthetics of grief. Who gets to decide what honor looks like and whether spectacle obscures sorrow? Scholars warned that commercialization could hollow ritual, turning graves into photo opportunities rather than sites of reflection. Yet even contentious decisions forced conversations, and conversation is a form of remembrance in itself. Committees met, then disagreed, then compromised on modest plaques that listed names without grand narratives. In the friction of debate, the community learned to protect specificity, each name a small demand against forgetting. The ground, indifferent to politics, continued to yield fragments that rebutted neat stories with stubborn particularity. Memory, it proved, is both tender and intransigent. No one imagined how the quiet endurance of these efforts would alter generational identity. Teenagers who had grown up hearing only sweeping national histories now raised questions at school assemblies. Who were these men really, and what did their deaths mean for us? Teachers like Marina Sokolova began to pair textbook lessons with field trips to Rzhev, guiding students to understand the difference between strategy and sacrifice. The effect was subtle but lasting. New generations learned to honor complexity, to see heroism and error as intertwined, and to refuse the solace of simplistic narratives. Children wrote essays about a named soldier, Pavel, Ivan, or Yuri, who had once been no more than a dash on a list, and then donated their pocket money to plant flowers at a grave. The cause was proximity, history made local, and the effect was civic empathy that resisted erasure. These small acts accumulated into a culture of attentive remembrance, where history's toll was measured by names rather than by slogans. The field became a classroom without walls, teaching a patient kind of citizenship. What they didn't yet know was how the landscape itself would insist on testimony through seasons and storms. Winters stripped back foliage and revealed more than memory. They revealed metal and bone, edges of the past that had been soft with moss in summer. Spring's thaw brought new discoveries and new griefs. Volunteers returned each year, winter-hardened and tender, to perform the slow, precise labor of recovery. Civil engineers drew maps of old trenches to prevent agricultural machinery from activating buried ordnance, a mundane but life-saving act linking past to present. Local governments funded small conservation projects to preserve markers and footprints, recognizing that neglect could erase the very traces that made history accountable. The cause was ongoing discovery. The effect was institutional embrace, slow and pragmatic, of a duty to remember properly. Museums expanded modestly, and local libraries archived oral histories on microfilm and digital servers, ensuring redundancy against loss. The field's testimony thus gained structures to hold it: the archives, the museums, the notebooks of the faithful. No one imagined that the final echo would be gentle rather than triumphant, a soft unwinding rather than a dramatic revelation. On a late autumn evening, Sergei Petrov returned once more to the low granite slab, his candle guttering as a lone star pricked the cold above the river. He stood a long time before speaking a name, and then another, sounding them into the dusk, not as accusation, but as benediction. Behind him, the birches whispered like ghosts whose speech was wind and whose counsel was patience. The sound was neither judgment nor comfort, but the simple, unadorned presence of the earth, listening. Children left small stones at the base of markers. Volunteers sealed the records for the year, and locked them in cabinets that would be opened again by the curious and the reverent. Across generations, the labor of remembrance shifted from urgency to stewardship, from discovery to the quiet maintenance of memory. The narratives that had once been political were absorbed into the human story, men and women who loved, feared, fought, and were lost. They were buried without triumph, without applause, yet in the hush of snow and wind, their story endures.